School Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. And Putin has checkmated Trump. NATO is in serious trouble. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, the geopolitical chessboard is very active, and NATO and Trump has put all of our lives in danger. Let's get to the contents. I knew this would happen. Very dangerous for us. Man, I've been predicted that all of the enemies of NATO will receive devastating weapons. That means Cuba. That means Venezuela.
On August 4th, Czech President Petr Pavel, responding to Western journalists' questions, suddenly and abruptly changed his rhetoric, admitting that Ukraine would not be able to defeat Russia on the battlefield, despite unprecedented military and financial support from NATO countries. According to the Czech leader, the preservation of Ukraine's statehood and sovereignty is now the top priority for Kyiv and the West. At the same time, he noted that if Ukraine has to cede part of its territory to Russia for this, then so be it. According to the Czech president, if Ukraine continues to fight against Russia, it will lose even more territories and human resources, which will inevitably lead to the loss of independence, sovereignty, and statehood of this Eastern European country. Describing the future surrender of Ukraine, President Petr Pavel stressed that Kyiv would cede part of Ukrainian territory to Russia not permanently, but temporarily. At the same time, he noted that the West would never recognize the occupied Ukrainian territories as part of the Russian Federation. We want Ukraine to survive no matter what. We want Ukraine to remain on the map of Europe as a sovereign and independent country. If the price of Ukraine's survival is that part of its territory will be temporarily occupied by the Russian army, then so be it. Western countries, including the Czech Republic, will never recognize the occupied territories of Ukraine as part of the Russian Federation, Petr Pavel said. At the end of his speech, the Czech leader admitted that defeating Russia on the battlefield would not be possible. According to him, the only way to defeat Russia is through sanctions pressure and the destruction of the Russian economy. According to him, only the collapse of the Russian economy will force Moscow to stop the fighting and retreat. My dear truth seekers, let me remind you that this confession by the President of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, caused a real shock in Kyiv. The fact is that Petr Pavel is one of the most ardent Russophobes in Europe. And starting in February 2022, this Czech Russophobe kept saying that Ukraine would win on the battlefield and force the Russian army to retreat in disgrace. However, as you can see, the current realities on the battlefield force even such ardent Russophobes as Petr Pavel to admit the inevitable defeat of Ukraine in the current conflict. At the same time, I am completely confident that the Czech leader's statement that Ukrainian territories will be temporarily transferred to Russia will also prove to be incorrect. It seems that the Czech president did not see Putin's speech to the expanded meeting of the Collegium of the Defense Ministry in 2024. In particular, in this speech, Putin explicitly declared that the Ukrainian conflict can be settled if all root causes are eliminated. At the same time, the Russian leader noted that Russia is not going to leave the Ukrainian nationalists the opportunity to start new hostilities to regain lost territories. Thus, Putin officially confirmed that if the existence of Ukraine threatens Russia's national security, Moscow will have to eliminate the sovereignty and statehood of this Eastern European country. Simply put, even if Russia does not absorb all of Ukraine, the rest of this country will be under the control of pro-Russian politicians, who will obey only Moscow. Meanwhile, on August 4th, at 11 a.m. Moscow time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation made a statement that shocked NATO countries, including the United States. In particular, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Ryabkov, officially announced that Russia had removed all restrictions on the deployment and use of intermediate-range and short-range missiles. At the same time, Sergei Ryabkov noted that these Moscow's actions were a response to the deliberate steps by the United States to completely dismantle the treaty on the elimination of intermediate-range and short-range missiles. According to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the United States not only dismissed this treaty unilaterally, but also began transferring specialized systems to Europe and other parts of the world. The main purpose of these systems is to launch intermediate-range and short-range missiles. At the same time, it is reported that the so-called U.S. allies have already announced that they intend to buy intermediate-range and short-range missiles from Washington, capable of hitting targets in the range from 500 to 5,500 kilometers.
That was a mistake.
The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs notes that all these unfriendly steps by the United States and its so-called allies in Europe lead to the formation and buildup of destabilizing missile capabilities in the regions adjacent to Russia, posing a direct threat to Russia's national security. Simply put, Russia has officially made it clear that due to the unfriendly actions of the so-called collective West, Moscow now has every right to deploy its intermediate-range and short-range missiles, including the world's most powerful Oceanic hypersonic ballistic missiles, wherever it sees fit, including Latin American countries such as Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua.
Now, they brought this on themselves. It'd be World War III, the end of the world, with them trying to stop Russia. With Trump, them foolishly saying that they will be putting these devastating weapons in NATO countries and in some of these European countries. Well, Russia had enough of that and said, okay, cool. Well, we're going to put some of our most powerful weapons that will absolutely terrify the U.S. in Venezuela, in Cuba, and in Nicaragua.
Moreover, commenting on Russia's lifting of a moratorium on the deployment of intermediate-range and short-range missiles, Dmitry Medvedev said that this is only the beginning of the West's headache, and that the main culprit of this escalation is NATO, with its anti-Russian policy. It is worth noting that immediately after the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced the lifting of a moratorium on the deployment of intermediate-range and short-range missiles, Russian military department closed the airspace over the Kapustin Yar test site, where, according to preliminary data, the world's most powerful Oceanic hypersonic ballistic missiles are based. Many experts are confident that, after Putin removed all restrictions on the use of intermediate-range and short-range missiles, Russian army is preparing to test a serial sample of the Oceanic hypersonic ballistic missile in Ukraine. According to their assertions, it is highly probable that the world will once again observe the employment of this distinctive missile in combat scenarios in the near future.
Russia has issued a new warning to the United States that they will no longer abide by the intermediate nuclear, the INF treaty about the internuclear missiles. Russia has announced this just recently. We got out of it back in 2019 under the first Trump administration. Russia, for various reasons, didn't get out of it until that time, but they have now done so today. And we're going to talk with Colonel Doug McGregor to find out what the ramifications are of this and whether this is something we need to be worried about, whether it's just no big deal at all. And then we're also going to look at where all the conflict in Ukraine is going, and if there's anything there we need to be worried about. So first of all, Colonel, welcome back to the show, as we always love to have you on.
Hey, good to be here.
Let's jump into that right away here, because on the one hand, it might seem like, well, it's kind of old news, but on the separate hand, there may be some new elements to this. Here, if you can put that Newsweek report back up here, this is what's coming out of the news. I think this actually came out yesterday. It says the Russian Foreign Ministry wrote, quote, against the backdrop of targeted steps by the United States, as a result of which the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty ceased to exist in 2019, and in subsequent years, the Russian Federation has proactively made efforts to maintain restraint in this area. The U.S. and its allies have not only openly outlined plans to deploy American land-based INF missiles in various regions, but have already made significant progress in practical implementations of their intentions. First of all, do you think that is there any substance to what the Russians are claiming there, or is this just them trying to justify putting more missiles into the mix?
No, I think they're being very truthful in the sense that we are trying to put weapons on the ground in Eastern Europe that can threaten Russia, that obviously violate the INF. The INF, as you know, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, was something that people worked very, very hard to build. And back in the 1970s and early 80s, when all of this came about, the Russians, or at that time the Soviets, had actually fielded intermediate range nuclear armed missiles. This posed a very immediate and dramatic and decisive threat, especially to Germany, Western Germany, and France and Italy and so forth. So we worked very, very hard to get this treaty established. One of the ways we did it was that we responded to the Soviets with our own Pershing missiles. Those missiles were brilliant weapons. There's no question about it. And at the time, the Soviets had no way to really match them. And these missiles would have reached their targets probably as soon as the Soviets launched their own missiles against us. I had a personal relationship with, at the time, Colonel Bill Odom, who later on became the National Security Agency head as a 3-star under Reagan and Weinberger. And he had a major role to play in that. And when I came back from Germany in 1980, he was asking what was the attitude. And our goal at that time was to prevent Germany from being leveraged out of the NATO alliance. There were people in Germany that said, well, the solution to all of this is we just declare neutrality, we'll leave NATO. Of course, that had no chance of happening, but there were lots of people saying it at the time. And we wanted to prevent that because we didn't see any reason why the Soviets should have the opportunity to bully and intimidate Europeans. So we developed the Pershing 1, Pershing 2 missiles were brilliant. The Soviets looked at this, came to the table and said, all right, let's ban this entire category, which was a very, very dramatic step and a very good one. It's unfortunate that in 2019, President Trump, on the advice, I think, of some people who were very wrong-headed, abolished that treaty. Now, there's some good news here, and that is that the New START treaty, the New Strategic Arms Limitations Talks treaty, called New START, signed under the Obama administration, was actually extended when it went out of business in 2021, and it was extended for another 6 years. So we don't have to worry about that strategic level nuclear agreement until 2026, next year. But these, some people view arms control as an illusion. It doesn't make any difference what people agree to do. They never completely agree to it. But the truth is that both we and the Soviets, and then subsequently we and the Russians, have done a pretty good job of adhering to the various treaties. These treaties have saved us a lot of money. And I think they have also created a climate of what I would call of thinking people that are sensitive to the nuclear issue, want to avoid a nuclear collision at all costs. And I think that's the real problem right now. Something has happened, and I'm not sure what it is, both in the senior ranks of the American military as well as in Washington among politicians on the Hill and in the White House. They think that this is something they can play with, that this is something they can maneuver. In other words, the whole threat of nuclear war. The Russians take it very seriously. They are not insensitive to the consequences of blast heat and radiation and the loss of millions of lives. But for some reason, we in the West don't seem to think in those terms. And so the Russians are taking prudent measures. They're going to move weapons closer into White Russia. They've already done some of that, as well as areas in the Western theater near St. Petersburg, north of that. And all of this is in response to things that we've been doing. And remember, we only very recently decided, for reasons that make no sense at all, to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Great Britain, England, in fact. These are weapons designed to be delivered by aircraft against targets like St. Petersburg. So then you look at the Kaliningrad disaster, this general who was the co-architect of the disaster in the Afghan withdrawal, Donahue, a man who spent most of his military career in special ops, where I'm sure he was quite good. I just don't think special ops necessarily prepares you for strategic level thinking and discussions and decision making. But nevertheless, we have no real general staff corps. We have no real meritocracy when it comes to the selection of senior officers. So his statement is frightening, because that's the kind of thing that leads you down the road to a nuclear disaster. And I think whether people realize it or not, we're on that road. I don't think the Russians are bluffing.
Well, in fact, I want to go further. So I just showed you that on the Newsweek there, where it had the foreign ministry, the Russian foreign ministry claim about why they pulled out of this. And then we have this morning, that was yesterday, this morning, Dmitry Medvedev on X just a couple of hours ago, I think, said that the Russian foreign ministry statement on the withdrawal of the moratorium on the deployment of medium and short-range missiles is the result of NATO countries' anti-Russian policy. This new reality, all our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. So what do you suspect that he may mean about these further steps?
I think his point is that the Russians are not bluffing. President Trump, as we both know, says one thing and 2 weeks later says another. And we know that he responded recently to the statements about that Medvedev made in a fit of anger. He was supposedly very angry. And he deployed 2 submarines to positions closer, presumably to Western Europe and Northern Europe than they had been otherwise deployed. First of all, you don't make decisions in a fit of anger. I mean, that's catastrophic. And then secondly, what Medvedev does is that he says things publicly that Putin absolutely refuses to say publicly. Remember, Putin's argument is, let's have private discussions. We can sit and talk about this in private. We don't discuss these matters in public, not because we want to keep everything hopelessly secret from the publics in Europe or the United States or Russia. But you can't make much progress when someone on the other side, and this is particularly true for President Trump, is exploiting the opportunity for some sort of political gain at home. And Putin wants nothing to do with that. So Medvedev, from time to time, steps out and he'll say something that Putin probably agrees with, but would never say himself. And I think that's what's happened. And Trump, President Trump, who is the head of state as well as the political leader of the country, would bother responding is really the question on my mind. Respond to President Putin by all means, but don't respond to Medvedev. He may be in the inner circle, but let's not impute to him anything more than an attack dog role, and understand what that is. I mean, the Russians don't like Lindsey Graham, but I can tell you that President Putin listens to what President Trump says, not to what Lindsey Graham says.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I want to just for those who may not know, because for some, 1987 will be ancient history. But I want to get kind of a running start to see what this INF treaty was supposed to mean for American interest and American national security, and then how that changed in 2019. So first of all, here is a short piece from Ronald Reagan's announcement on the day he signed the INF treaty in 1987.
This treaty protects the interests of America's friends and allies. It also embodies another important principle, the need for glasnost, a greater openness in military programs and forces. We can only hope that this history-making agreement will not be an end in itself, but the beginning of a working relationship that will enable us to tackle the other issues, urgent issues before us. Strategic offensive nuclear weapons, the balance of conventional forces in Europe, the destructive and tragic regional conflicts that beset so many parts of our globe, and respect for the human and natural rights that God has granted to all men.
Now, obviously, that kind of gets to what you said a second ago, that aside from the specific issue of the terms of the treaty, whether they're being abided by or not, is one thing, but it also provides additional things, opportunities to talk to prevent any kind of general war, because they were really motivated, Reagan was, by preventing any kind of nuclear conflict. That seems to be the genesis of it for sure. But let me ask you, was his concern that he said, we don't want this to go in this other direction here because that wouldn't be good for us, was that borne out?
I think the INF treaty was a step in the right direction. It did produce openness. From our standpoint, it helped to eliminate a category of very dangerous weapons for all intents and purposes. That meant that both sides agreed, we're not going to use these. As soon as you decide not to use a particular category of nuclear weapons, that sends a hugely important signal to everyone. It means neither side wants to go to nuclear war. Very, very important. Now, the other thing that Reagan did mention, but was very important at the time, was to keep Germany inside the NATO alliance. And I can't stress that enough, because there were attitudes in Germany among many people that this is something they didn't want. They did not want nuclear weapons on German soil. And actually speaking, Eisenhower struggled with this in the 1950s. And he was approached about something very similar. Said, well, you have to put nuclear weapons into Germany. He says, I don't want to. And he said, by the way, if we put them there and the Soviets attack, they're in such overwhelming numbers, they'll overrun the nuclear weapons before we get a chance to use them. So he said, if we're going to have nuclear weapons, they should be at sea, or they could be delivered by the Air Force, or they should be on the periphery. In other words, perhaps Norway, Iceland, or North Africa, but not in Central East Europe. Ultimately, he reneged because people said, no, again, we can't get the Germans to stay in the alliance and we don't promise to protect them. And that means we have to put nuclear weapons on the ground in Germany, because that then becomes a last minute trigger for the use of strategic nuclear weapons if it looks like Germany could possibly be overrun. Now, that's the past. Here we are today. What are we doing right now? Well, as I said before, we've kept New START in existence. So on the strategic level, we're still abiding largely by the guidelines that define launchers and warheads for strategic nuclear weapons. That's a very good thing. I think it's a very bad thing that we've opened up this can of worms, though, with the INF, because the missiles that we see now, you look at the Oreshnik, for instance, we can't stop it. We can't stop any of these hypersonic missiles. We can have hypersonic missiles launched from any number of different locations, and we can't stop them. We need to get that across. The most recent studies by NATO suggested that they could only defend perhaps 5% of NATO territory with air and missile defense. So who are we kidding?
Yeah.
You're talking about going to war. You've lost your mind. Today, I was sent a report from a source inside NATO about the transportation infrastructure and rail lines. It said, we're not prepared for a large-scale war. The transportation infrastructure is not sufficiently developed. We don't have control of it. We don't have any means of protecting it. So again, it's just craziness on steroids. I think it was James Madison in Federalist number 10 who said, we may not always have especially bright, capable, intelligent, and informed statesmen at the helm. In other words, he was talking about the White House. Therefore, we have the Supreme Court. Therefore, we have Congress and so forth. Well, we don't have very many enlightened people anywhere right now.
Right, yeah.
They're out of touch with reality. They don't get it. Every single exercise, and I certainly saw several of these. And yeah, you may have as well, but I certainly did, particularly when I was a full colonel and I monitored these things and I was able to read about them, particularly when I was at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. All the exercises and simulations that involved direct conflict with the Soviets, they all reached the same conclusion. Inevitably, if we go to war with these people, we're going to have a nuclear exchange. It's very simple. We can't field enough conventional forces. We started back in the 1960s. We developed this thing called flexible response. We were trying to find any way we could to sort of keep the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons very, very high. But nevertheless, in all of these, we inevitably went to the use of a nuclear weapon. Then the other conclusion was, well, if we do this, we can't control escalation. Whereas once you use the nuclear weapon, it's over. And then finally, General Powell in the early 1990s, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he said, don't come in here and tell me we could drop a tactical nuke on somebody and the Russians are not, or the Soviets are not going to say, that's a nuke. In other words, oh, no, don't worry about that. That's a low-yield nuclear weapon. That's not going to lead to any major country. He says, that's just crazy. That's complete nonsense. So the conclusion that everybody reached, I don't want to say everybody because there are always outliers, but the majority of senior military leaders, and I would argue even on the Hill, people like Sam Nunn and others had reached the conclusion that you wanted to avoid war with the Soviets at all cost. Well, all of a sudden now you've got a president who seems to be going out of his way to provoke the Russians. And he now has as one of his spokesmen a 4-star general who is threatening Russian national sovereign territory around Kaliningrad, this little enclave of East Prussia that FDR gave Stalin at the end of the war, or in the spring of 1945. That's unfortunate. I don't think FDR should have done that, but then again, there are a lot of things that FDR should not have done, but it's irrelevant now. It's whatever.
Yeah, it is.
That's now Russian national territory. If you attack it, everything is fair game. You're going to be at war with the Russian state. Now, this is nuts. This is insane. No sitting general officer should announce to the world any intention, right, or confirm. This is even more important. If you're a Russian intelligence officer, this is a bonanza, because he's just confirmed that these aren't just intentions. We have plans.
Plans, yeah.
Insane. What planet are these people on? And listen, I don't think this is something, by the way, that this General Donahue cooked up. I think he was given leave to say this. Did he suggest it? Maybe. I don't know. But I think he had been given the green light to do it, which worries me even more, because that suggests that you have people in the SecDef's office as well as in the White House that are out of touch with reality. You don't want to go down this road for the reasons I just answered. We've been avoiding this stuff for 60 years?
Right.
All of a sudden now it's okay. Have these people lost their minds? I don't know, but it's back to Madison. We will not always have enlightened men at the helm of state. No kidding.
Well, and this whole situation here started not just recently, but under the first President Trump term. Here's what he said in 2019 when we got out, claiming that the Russians were cheating.
But for the last few years, the U.S. says Russia has developed and deployed this missile on display last week in Moscow that violates the treaty, and Russia refused U.S. requests to destroy it. Today, President Trump said as long as Russia wasn't abiding by the treaty, neither would the U.S.
So unless we're going to have something that we all agree to, we can't be put at the disadvantage of going by a treaty, limiting what we do when somebody else doesn't go by that treaty.
But the Russians say this American missile defense system in Romania could be modified to launch an offensive missile, and therefore the U.S. is the violator. Today, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov called the U.S. suspension a mistake.
We think that the agreement is essential. It is within interests of our security and European security, and it would be irresponsible for one side to shatter it.
So what do you think about that claim at the time that President Trump made, that the Russians were cheating with that missile that they were showing on the screen there, and therefore that's why we got out?
Well, let's go back to what the last Russian said or talked about, which is the air and missile defense installation in Romania. Remember, this is something that we established there ostensibly for the purpose of protecting Europe from Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, let's stop and consider that for a minute. Here's Iran, and this is what year, 2019?
Right.
And has never expressed any interest in or any intention under any circumstances to attack anyone in the world with anything except Israel in response to an attack. Now, that I didn't even mention ballistic missiles, but we put this thing into Romania and said that with the radars and the anti-missile missiles, these things pose no threat to Russia. This was entirely focused on Iran. Well, I'm sure the Russians doubled over in laughter. Why would they ever believe such a thing? When I was on active duty, I suggested that in order to allay Russian fears, which I quickly found out nobody gave a damn about, was to invite the Russians to inspect the facility to satisfy themselves that this facility was, in fact, not aimed at them. So, well, that's ridiculous, McGregor. You've lost your mind. We're never going to do such a thing. Well, that's what you do if you don't want a war.
War, yeah.
You know, I mean, I've talked about this before, and it's never a guarantee that it will work. But for decades, you had a personal adjutant, we would say aide de camp, assigned to the German emperor, one assigned to the Russian emperor, and one assigned to the emperor in Vienna in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Each one represented an emperor from the other camp. And this was designed to ensure that personal communications between the three could occur regardless of the circumstances, conditions, crises, conflicts, whatever. That ultimately falls apart in 1914. Actually, it fell apart a little bit before then, but it was a good idea. There is no reason why we should not have a system between Beijing, Moscow, and the United States to deal routinely all the time with these matters. We should have liaison officers here from those two nations, and ours should be where they are. The whole thing is to allay fear. In other words, to build confidence, reassure that there is no intention to strike anybody. Now, again, somebody will say, well, McRae, you've lost your mind. You know, we deter these people because they don't know what we'll do. Very, very dangerous position to take with nuclear weapons. It's very easy to misinterpret any kind of action we may take any number of different places as evidence for an imminent strike. And
Right.
the same thing is true today for us. We don't know enough about Russia. We used to know a great deal more. We don't know very much right now. And I think the Russians don't really understand early warning. And I think Ted Postal has spoken to you about this, may have spoken to others, that their early warning system leaves much to be desired. We ought to be interested in those things. Instead, we are actively provoking, offending, insulting, and attacking people on every conceivable level. And people need to understand that sanctions are not harmless, that what they are meant to do damage. And most people, most of the time in the world, regard the use of economic sanctions as an act of war. We need to get out of that business.
And you know, some of these concerns that are playing out, some of which you just mentioned, were listed in 2019 by a European Federica Mogherini, who was worried about the development in the negative direction.
Today, NATO backed the U.S. accusation against Russia, but some European officials, like EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini, fear the start of a new arms race. From the late 70s to the late 80s, the Soviet Union and the U.S. deployed mobile nuclear-tipped missiles to Europe. The INF eliminated them, and European officials say they don't want to turn back the clock.
What we definitely don't want to see is our continent going back to being a battlefield or a place where other superpowers confront themselves. This belongs to a faraway history.
And now that faraway history is run back up. I mean, you literally just described the very scenario she feared about.
Yeah, well, here we are. And I think it's gotten worse, because this is really about Trump, who thinks he's leading a crusade against BRICS. He's trying to bash, bully, intimidate anyone who does business with Russia. He's tried to do that to China. It's all failed miserably. None of it is going to change anything. Fighting BRICS is a losing battle at this stage. If anything, BRICS is a consequence of our behavior in the past. People are just really tired of being bullied by us through the IMF, the World Bank, the SWIFT system. This is what de-dollarization is all about. And I think that President Trump and his advisors undoubtedly have told him this, that you can use the strategic military dimension as a way to leverage our power against BRICS. And of course, you have the other problem is the same people that want us to go to war in the Middle East all the time are the same people that are pushing war against Russia, even though they keep insisting, well, we're not talking about a direct confrontation. Well, if you're not talking about a direct confrontation, you certainly sound like it. And they hate Russia. They hate it because it's the primary fortress holding out against globalism. And President Trump, who we thought we elected because he was not a globalist, seems to have taken on the mantle of leadership for globalism. So destroy Russia, destroy Orthodox Christianity, destroy the population, destroy its people, strip it of resources, on and on and on. It's just insane. It's crazy. It's all failed. There's no chance that it's going to happen anytime soon. But nevertheless, he's leading this now. I don't even think he understands what he's leading. This is not something in the interest of the American people or the United States.
Well, and let's just keep going down the list of concerns here. Whatever he may have intended, it seems that it's kind of opening up others to continue moving down in provocative areas against Russia, maybe part of that same plan that you're talking about, or at least intent. And that, Gary, if you can throw up in your browser that there's a plan by the UK to interdict, let's see, according to this, Britain plans to use NATO allies to launch a mass attack on the so-called Shadow Fleet, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service has said. This is what the Russians are claiming that they have intercepted that the UK plans to do. According to London's plan, the impetus for such a campaign should be a closely watched incident involving one or more tankers. The plan envisions large-scale diversion, the damage of which will allow declaring the transport of Russian oil a threat to all international shipping. What do you make of this claim here? Is that valid?
Well, first of all, we don't have multiple sources that can confirm this. And this is based on what is allegedly an intelligence capture, right? Somebody intercepted the signal, somebody's decoded it, somebody's read it, or it was provided over the clear. We don't know. What we can say is that MI6 in Great Britain has been at the very beginning of this war with Ukraine, heavily involved in what I would call the false flag, dirty tricks agenda. We know that they provided the false flags in Syria that led President Trump to launch missiles into the desert in Syria. This is back during his first term. We know that the SAS working with MI6 has been very effective in little raids that designed to embarrass the Russians, damage ships sitting in harbor, hit isolated radars or missile sites, or simply terrorize the Russian population by killing Russian civilians. So I wouldn't be surprised. But what I think is interesting is the following. First of all, the British are talking about what amounts to a sea embargo. In other words, using American and allied naval power, primarily U.S. naval power, to intercept and halt the transport of oil over the sea, oil that's Russian, in origin, presumably. That's very interesting to me because, the British, this is their thinking. Britain, like us, is historically a maritime power. The problem with that is I don't think it would make much difference anymore. Oh, it'll hurt a little bit if we were to do it. But you have this thing called the One Belt, One Road, and we've already seen the trains coming from China all the way to Iran now. We're going to see more of this rail and road infrastructure open up with the result that they'll be able to travel over the space of a few days what normally would take weeks at sea. So I don't think this is I don't think you can expect the level of success from this that is implied. But here's something else. You start stopping other people's ships carrying oil that ostensibly or reputedly comes from Russia, you're going to be at war again. You're going to be not just at war with Russia, but any number of different countries. I mean, this makes a mockery of our supposed interest in freedom of navigation. It's the exact opposite. We're freedom of navigation for us and nobody else.
Yeah, that's not going to work very well. I also want to discuss something about the if there is this, whether it's a coordinated plan or just common thinking that the West just wants to keep harming Russia, whether it's this way or just keeping the war going. I don't know that that's going to be very effective. There was an interesting comment in it's called the Resident Telegram channel, a Ukrainian resident. They made some interesting comments here. It says that against the backdrop of the EU's strategic paralysis and the U.S.'s sluggishness on giving ammunition to Ukraine, Trump claimed he was going to do it, but none of the stuff has come through yet. It has been half a month since Trump proposed that Europeans buy weapons for Kiev, but no agreed procurement mechanism has appeared. Some countries are unwilling to allocate funds. Others have outright refused to participate. All this is happening while even moderate Ukrainian analysts warn, quote, if the situation does not change by winter, Russian troops will be near Kiev. And then it goes on to continue to talk about how everything's just falling apart in Ukraine. There was a report out that, that's the one right there, that one of the Ukrainian official said that the reconnaissance support estimated that Ukraine's military was suffering daily casualties of 300 dead, 750 injured per day, and about 500 troops desert every day. And she also warned that Russian forces could be up to Kiev by the winter if we don't change something. But there is no evidence that anything can be changed. That's from the Times in London on Sunday. So the situation on the battlefield is falling apart, and the Ukraine's troops, which has always been, I think, kind of the linchpin, no matter how many weapons or ammunition or anything else. And we could also talk about all these aerial attacks that Russia's been stepping up. One of the other things that the resident mentioned here is that the Ukrainian intelligence suggests that by the end of this year, the number of drone strikes from Russia could be over 1,000 per day, not just hundreds, but in the thousands, and it will continue to escalate up. So is this plan going to continue to go on? And what do you think, actually, a better question, is the risk for us to bring this to an end or risk going to a nuclear war? Why do we want to do that, Doug? Why would anyone want to risk a nuclear escalation instead of just bringing this to an end?
I hope, I can't prove it, but I hope that more sober minds will prevail, certainly in the Department of Defense, and make it very clear that the notion of escalating to the level of nuclear conflict is simply off the table, that there's no chance for that to have any good outcome. And I would hope that somebody would also urge the president, at least through his advisors, to reconsider the wisdom of mentioning it, not overreacting. Too many people emote. This is particularly true in Washington and particularly true for President Trump. This is not the time to emote. Now, that's the first thing. Second thing is all of this business, this equipment that's being promised, in some cases, it doesn't even exist. When you start looking at Patriot batteries and radars and missiles, that's not even around. I mean, what are you going to ship over there? And even if you shipped what was promised by President Trump, somebody said to me from Raytheon, we're looking at 15 minutes of air-to-air and missile defense. In other words, there's not enough missiles to make a damn difference. And I think that's something that hasn't sunk in. I think the president should be briefed in great detail on this and understand that he can promise the sun, maybe get the moon, and probably only long after Ukraine has fallen apart. Now, this morning, there was a published statement allegedly drawn from the Russian general staff that Ukraine has at the outside 3 months left, 90 days. And that within those 90 days, everything will collapse. Now, the reason was that first we've got battalions of boys and old men. I mean, I can just see guys like me at my age running around with rifles out there. Good luck. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is true with boys, kids that are 15, 14, 15, 16. This is absurd. It's ridiculous. So this regime is dying. There's no question about it. And long before MI6 gets to install Zaluzhny, as their chosen successor to Zelensky, this thing is going to be over. So the question is, what do you do if you're sitting in the White House? Well, President Trump is very loath to stand up publicly and say, well, I guess I was wrong. I couldn't end this in 24 hours. Oh, I guess I was wrong. I can't bring these people to the peace table. I guess I was wrong. You know, that's not going to happen. You're going to hear a lot of stupid crap about, well, President Trump tried his best, but President Putin lied to him. Well, that's all nonsense. That's just crap. Listen to what President Putin says over and over and over again. It has not changed over the last 36 months, frankly. And he's taken steps periodically to tell them exactly what the conditions are. Finally, there's this. What did we do after the Vietnam debacle? We stopped talking about it. Did you ever hear anybody stand up and say, well, I was right, but, you know, things didn't work out quite that way. So, no, nobody does that. Generals don't stand up and say, I was wrong. Everything I predicted never happened. My assessments were wrong. You could start with General Paul Harkins back in 1963, go all the way through up to Fred Wyand at the end as the commander in Vietnam. Nobody does that. And I think what will happen is what we recommended, at least I recommended from the very beginning. President Trump, you want this to stop? We agree. Cease the delivery of all military aid immediately. Arrange for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians that need it, and medical care and so forth, through a third country. Get everyone who is an American citizen, whether they're in or out of uniform, whether they're intelligence or conventional military, it doesn't make any difference. All need to get out of Ukraine now. Do those things, and the Russians will then take you seriously because they'll recognize, oh, the Americans have finally figured it out. We don't have any vital strategic interest in Ukraine. We never have. I mean, that's the simple truth. We wish everybody well, but we're not interested. This is an artificially created war. We created it with the help of our British friends and others in NATO. It needs to end. Only we can end it quickly. But you don't end it by presiding at some peace talk where everybody stands next to you and smiles and says, we love you, President Trump. You're such a great man. That's not going to happen. So just cut bait. Get out. You would think a businessman who has seen more than a few bad investments over many years would know when, that's it. We're going to take the loss and move on. We can't, let's not feed this loss anymore.
Right. Exactly.
Be done with it. That's what he needs to do. I think eventually that's what we will do. Because if you go down the road that's being charted by this General Donahue, you're going to destroy everything.
Well, here's the worry. You just a second ago you said, the hope is that maybe saner heads can eventually prevail to come to the conclusions that you just mentioned here. But to the contrary, you have people emoting, as you said a second ago, also in the opposite direction. You mentioned earlier about the trolling, basically, that Medvedev did against Trump when he said the issue. Gary, if you can put that up there, where Medvedev said, the dead hand. No, not that one. The other one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, where he said, and about India's and Russia's dead economies entering very dangerous territory. Well, let him remember his favorite movies about the Walking Dead, as well as how dangerous the fabled dead hand can be. And that's where Trump interpreted, or else someone interpreted for him, that Medvedev was threatening nuclear war against the United States, which is not what the dead hand is. We'll just point that out, first of all. But in response, that's when Trump sent those nuclear subs publicly. As you said, he responded out of emotion to send something in, which is a signal that you're thinking more seriously about nuclear weapons. Well, if anyone was wondering what kind of reaction that would get from the group of people that, like the Donahues and some others, we got that from Brother Jack Keane.
What Medvedev did here to precipitate the president's actions, it once again brandished the threat of nuclear weapons use. And believe me, this is a part of their instrument of national power. They use psychological warfare, is how I would describe it. And they were quite successful in the Biden administration because as a result of threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons, Biden restricted the use of our weapons. He held them back, long-range missiles, tanks, F-16s, to name a few. the Europeans were onto it, and they realized that this was a bluff, and we should stop submitting to that bluff and changing our behavior. And they forced the Biden administration to provide those items I just suggested, the Europeans, that is, because they were, in a sense, calling the Russians bluff. The president has heard this, and he wants them to know unequivocally that he's in charge here. He's not going to submit to this kind of intimidation and coercion and psychological warfare. And that is a message he is sending by announcing the deployment of 2 nuclear-powered submarines.
That's the message he's sending. So Putin is just bluffing, and Biden deserves condemnation because he was worried about nuclear war, but Trump is not, because he's tough, and that's what Putin's going to have to wonder. What does that tell you about where we're heading?
Well, I think we need to pause and point out, and I think Scott Ritter and Larry Johnson and others have done this, that the dead hand is simply a mechanism that ensures that if the Russians are a victim of first strike, and regardless of how much damage the first strike does, including kill them in great numbers, the dead hand is simply a mechanism that ensures that the Russians strike back with everything they've got. That's about it. So it's really a defensive mechanism. It's not an offensive one. So it's important to keep that in mind. The second thing, as we've said before, this is Medvedev. This is not Putin. President Trump should respond to other heads of state, not to people that are not heads of state, frankly. They don't matter. What matters is what the head of state says, the man who's actually in control. Now, the last bit of this is disturbing because Trump's personality is easily manipulated by people who are saying, well, if you do this, boss, you're going to be tough. And that's what Americans want. They want a tough guy out there to lay down the law and make it clear what we're not going to do and what they have to do. A lot of people in my generation that were involved in the Vietnam War, unfortunately, are very easily seduced by this. More than one person who was in Vietnam has said to me on several occasions, we got to be tough with these people. They're bad. We know them. We dealt with them before. You know, come on, this is not the Cold War. These people are not communists. They're Russians. And while there is always overlap, because underlying culture and national identity, ethnicity, religion, language, all those things always assert themselves and are always more important than any ideology. In this particular case, what they're being accused of and what is real are not the same thing, as you know, and as you pointed out. But this kind of thing very much appeals to the boomer generation, of which I'm a member. And I think Jack Keane exemplifies this. It's all about bullying somebody and being tough. Well, not really. This is about avoiding nuclear war, period, at all costs. It's about identifying real strategic interests, not imaginary interests. There is no interest on our part in what happens in eastern Ukraine, never has been. You could make an argument that we should have made it clear from the very beginning that at least the Dnieper River should be respected as a demarcation line beyond which we recommend the Russians not move. That could have been done early on, and that would have made sense. And I think the Russians feel that way in any case, because if they had wanted to cross that river, they could have done that much earlier than has happened. I mean, they just have refused to cross that river because they don't want Ukraine. They've never been interested in ruling Ukrainians. Anybody who knows the history knows the Western Ukrainians, knows the Poles, knows the Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians. The Russians don't want to be bothered with those people. They're not fools. What they're trying to do is secure their country. And they want people to respect their legitimate national security interests. So this has nothing to do with being strong or bullying anybody. But I think President Trump is receptive to that message. It's not a good message. He shouldn't be. And again, it goes back to my earlier comment. Sometimes we won't have enlightened men at the helm, as pointed out by James Madison. So it's important that we have people in uniform as well as people who are civilian appointees and elected to office that will exercise a little more, let us say, balanced common sense.
Well, we can certainly hope that that occurs at some point, or even just self-interest. If it gets to any kind of critical point, will rule the day and prevent stupidity that could lead to catastrophic outcomes for our country.
And there's something else. There's one thing to also point out that everybody misses. We always have missile boats and attack subs at sea. That's probably arguably the most important strategic instrument at our disposal in terms of national defense. That's why I think our submarine fleet is too small and needs to be much larger and more capable.
Yeah.
Always have, and felt that should be our top priority. But we've always had those ships out there, those boats, rather. And those boats can attack Russia or anybody else very quickly from any number of locations. The second thing is the Russians have boats like that. And they, too, are off our shores. Who are we kidding? We need to wake up and understand that this is a very dangerous set of circumstances. Someone brought to my attention, I think it was 2010 or 2011, the people in Nome, Alaska were isolated. It had been a terrible ice storm, massive snows, worse than what you would normally expect. And we couldn't get any fuel oil to them. And so the Coast Guard finally said, listen, the only people that can get fuel to these people quickly are the Russians. And we asked the Russians to help. And they did. They sent a tanker in behind a Coast Guard icebreaker. And we were lucky to have that icebreaker because at the time, there were other icebreakers and they were all out of commission. Today, the Russians have the largest fleet of icebreakers in the world.
All right.
But my point is, we asked for help and assistance, and they gave it quickly and unhesitatingly, and they didn't gouge us on the price of the oil, which I can't emphasize enough. We got to get past this artificial conflict that has been created in Ukraine.
Agreed. Couldn't agree with you more.
How to do that, except the president has got to stand up and be courageous and say, this needs to end. I'm ending it. This is what I'm doing. We're getting out. But thus far, there's no evidence that he will do that.
Yeah, and I worry that on Friday, on the 8th of August, he's just going to take it another notch in the wrong direction with all these sanctions and all that. But we'll have to hold that for another day. In the amount of time I got with you today, though, there's news out this morning that Benjamin Netanyahu either is or maybe already.
Salute to our brother Gary Marshall for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, family. Salute.
Already out of a cabinet meeting where he's going to give approval for the occupation of the entirety of the Gaza Strip. And in a Fox News meeting this morning, there was a pro-Israeli guy named Dov Heikind who was explaining why this is something Netanyahu has to do.
I believe it will be approved by the cabinet, and Israel really has absolutely no choice. There was a deal on the table. Israel was prepared to make concessions to get back some of the hostages, and Hamas, with the support that it is getting from radicals all over the world, they believe they're winning. They believe that their plan, what they are demanding that they be able to keep their weapons and that they continue to control Gaza into the future. That's impossible. That can never happen. The leaders of Hamas just a couple of days ago said, applauded what happened on October 7th and said, we will do it again and again. And we can believe Hamas when they say that.
So what do you make of the fact that Israel is afraid of Hamas? And man, if they don't go in and clean this deal out and basically eliminate, and I mean all of the Hamas, which I think maybe would mean every male in the Gaza Strip, what do you make of that charge?
Well, the Israeli chief of staff, who seems to be a very able man, has pointed out that it could take years to root out Hamas from Gaza. Stop and consider that. And they're talking about an area right now roughly the size of Philadelphia. And if you send in the IDF, they'll be there for years. That's his warning. I don't think you need to say too much beyond that. However, Mr. Netanyahu and his country is in a very difficult position. Now, what is that position? The two of them, both he and his country, are facing desperation. He has launched a number of different attacks in different directions at different people. on the assumption that he'd better do this while he has absolute unconditional control of the United States. And he does right now. He has the immediate obedience of the U.S. Armed Forces. Israel first is the motto in this administration. So if you're in his position, and remember, he's got his own private problems, but if you look at the state as a whole, in his view, he's either got to win it all or lose it all. Because anything he does, short of total extermination of the Palestinians in Gaza and the destruction of all his other enemies in the region, means that Israel might not succeed. If it doesn't succeed, in his view, it will be destroyed. In other words, this is a do or die moment for him. And I don't think he sees that he has any alternative. So I'm sure the IDF chief of staff has been told that. And you're going to see them do exactly what this previous spokesman, Heikind, said. Now, how this is going to suppress the forces of anti-Semitism is beyond my imagination. I mean, I think the only thing that's happened over the last year or so is that anti-Semitism has reached new heights and continues to spread because there's so much hatred for Israel. So I don't know how he thinks this is somehow or another going to defeat anti-Semitism. I think he'll just feed the fires of it. And that has always been my objection to this, that the way Israel has set this thing up is exactly what Netanyahu is doing. It's a do or die moment. And they're probably not going to survive.
Well, I was going to say, it may also be a do and die moment if he does it.
Oh, yeah.
So I think this will be counterproductive because, I mean, yesterday there was I saw a video that there was 300,000 people marching in Sydney, Australia, because there is growing Western anger against the Netanyahu government, against the policies of Israel. Obviously, we have issues where there is reports of large-scale deaths from hunger, malnutrition at serious rates. We showed on our show yesterday that American Lieutenant Colonel Special Forces guy, Tony Aguilar, who returned from on the ground there and reported that the atrocities are as bad as what people are claiming, completely contradicting what our own ambassador said, what Benjamin Netanyahu said just days before that. You can't just, even if you just said, just look at it purely military, it would be dumb to get into something that's going to last years and not be able to solve it. But Doug, do you see that Israel politically, I'm talking internationally, they continue to have this situation where they continue the war in the Gaza Strip where people are dying in large numbers?
Well, I think their hope is that the Egyptian army, which is sitting across from them, I guess there are 50 or 60,000 troops over there, will relent and instead of intervene in support of the Palestinians who are facing imminent destruction, will instead tear down the barriers and allow the Palestinians to pour into the Sinai. I think that's what they're hoping. I don't know. I mean, right now it seems that paralysis grips the government in Cairo. The Sisi has decided that doing nothing is his best option. But that could change very quickly. General Sisi may or may not survive. And a new regime may come to power and say, the hell with this, we're going to fight. Now, the argument is that, like Turkey, Egypt is a financial economic basket case. They're too in debt. They can't do anything. But then that assumes that the Russians, the Chinese, and others who are sympathetic to them will not help them in some way. So I wouldn't bet on that. But that's where we are. And, it's interesting. The Australian government, the new one, has just agreed to buy naval combatants, ships, weapons from Japan. In other words, they've moved away from us. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future. The Japanese have told us, frankly, to fly a kite. They're going to buy as much oil and gas as they want from Russia. They could care less. The Chinese, the same thing. I think this BRICS thing is going to accelerate. I think you're going to have more and more and more members saddle up and join. It makes sense to do so. Otherwise, you are in a debt trap created for you by the United States government and the dollar. So I think all of this is going to backfire. Again, what do you do if you're president of the United States? you're interested in doing what's in the interest of the American people. Is it in our interest to be co-conspirators in the mass murder or expulsion of millions of people from Gaza? Does this help us and assist us in any way in the region? Does it assist us globally? I don't think it does. You can ask the same question about how does it help us to stay engaged in eastern Ukraine and cause battalions of boys and old men at gunpoint to be herded into Russian machine gun, artillery, and rocket fire. I don't think it does. But, I hold the minority opinion right now, and this is, after all, the Israel First administration.
Well, that's it's a really unpleasant thing to have to hear, but the evidence seems to pretty strongly support that because, like you say, it's not in America's interest to attack Iran when we weren't threatened by anything. So it's hard to argue with your statement there. And I just don't know where this is going to end up with America. It doesn't seem to me this is sustainable, but I don't have a clear vision on, what it would manifest into. I mean, what is your view on, because you mentioned those two things, our support for Ukraine, our support for Israel are not in America's interest and are antithetical to our interest, but where do you see this going? How might it affect America?
Well, I think NATO and the European Union are both going to go out of business. It's a question of when, not if. There is tremendous discontent in Europe with the European Union that has tried to make itself into an international governing body and subjugate all of Europe to its will. That's dead. Everybody's sick to death of it. Most people in most cases are sympathetic to President Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia. I think you're going to see more people like that emerge. The leadership in Croatia is much more sober-minded, has refused to have anything to do with the stupidity in Ukraine. I think Slovenia is not far behind, but they're smaller and a little less courageous as a result. I understand there's their reservations. So I think the EU thing is going to collapse. It's coming. Italy is already on the edge of dumping it. The Greeks are. So that's going to go away. NATO, what is NATO? Where is the great NATO army that's prepared to arm up, saddle up, and march east? I don't see it. I think anybody who imagines that is, smoking something, and it's not legal. So I think these institutions have outlived their utility and their necessity. So I guess what you'll see is a sort of a gradual abandonment of NATO and this Ukraine madness that starts in Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania and moves west.
So let me ask you this in the last bit of time we have here. Let me give you a scenario, which I don't think at all is, outlandish or improbable. One is that eventually you're going to have the Ukraine army just collapse. Yeah, at some point it nearly has to, just by math. And separately, that either the Western or American economies, specifically, have a severe recession. And there's lots of warning signs on our economy right now, despite President Trump firing the person who gave the bad news the other day. I don't think that's going to change the actual reality on the ground, which is not trending in a good direction. And all these tariffs he's talking about putting on possibly on Friday could accelerate that demise. What happens to those two issues you mentioned there, support for NATO and support for Ukraine, if the Ukraine army collapses or if our economy collapses, and God help us if both of those things happen?
Well, I think many people like Jeffrey Gundlach and certainly Peter Schiff, I think also James Ricard, a number of people out there have all said, look, when this financial crisis strikes, and in fact, Warren Buffett made this point, there will be no TARP. In other words, there's not going to be a rescue package that comes out of the government. Those days are over. Private equity is in a lot of trouble. You've got people like Larry Fink and David Rubenstein that are staring at the abyss. They could lose trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. We have $3 trillion dollars worth of commercial real estate investment in our banking system. And the real estate market, both residential and commercial, is poised to plummet. So no one can predict with accuracy when this happens. Nassim Taleb has talked about this. He's much more competent to discuss it than I am. He's the one that pointed out there is no reserve currency except gold. And I think he's right. So if you take all of those things together, you know this is coming, Dan. You're right. When that comes, and I don't know exactly when, but I think sooner rather than later. A lot of people say, oh, no, we can go on like this for years. No, I don't think so. When that happens, people are going to say, Ukraine? What's that? The Middle East? No, that's not important. In other words, everything beyond the borders of the United States will shrink to insignificance to what's happening here at home, because we'll be dealing with supply chain problems, the distribution of food, products that are vital to everyday life. The one area where we may not have serious problems, at least initially, fortunately, is fuel. But that could change. And prices, we've artificially suppressed interest rates. And despite that, if you look at the bond market, we're trying to hold down interest rates. And what happens in the bond market? The yields keep rising and rising, and then they'll fall back a little bit, and then they rise and rise. They fall back a little bit, and they rise and rise. At some point, you're going to hit 5% on the 10-year bonds, and most people regard that as the bellwether of disaster. And we can't pay the debt, what we owe, the interest on our national sovereign debt, which is now over 37 trillion and rapidly expanding. So I think your point is valid. It's almost as though we're living in a house and we've got a fire in the kitchen, and everyone is saying, well, that's in the kitchen. We're here in the living room. Those in the dining room are fine. The fire's not going to spread. They've got it under control. Well, good luck with that, because I don't think so. And eventually it'll burn the house down. That's what people have been predicting. I think they're right. And then who cares what happens down the road in the next town over? You're worried about your own home. And I think that's what will happen in the United States.
I think that probably will. And unfortunately, I think it's going to require that, because I think too many people are just like, I'm not worried about that. And it's the collapse. And people have been warning about the looming economic downturn. It hasn't happened. Like, even though 2008 happened, it's like, well, that was an anomaly, but it hadn't happened now. So it's never going to. So we don't have to make any changes. That's why I think it's going to require that before we finally wake up. And well, that's going to have a lot of consequences, but well, I guess we'll have to visit those when we get there. But in any case, boy, really appreciate this great deal of clarity you had with us today, because this really does point out just what's at stake here and what's not important to the United States, and what we should do to reevaluate or reestablish our priorities. And I really appreciate that.
Okay, Dan, good to see you.
And listen also to you guys.
Thanks so much for joining me today.
Bom dia.
Yes.
Good day. Good day in Portuguese.
Yes. Well, let's talk then about these nuclear escalations. So here is the Russian Foreign Ministry's statement concerning the moratorium on deploying ground-based intermediate and short-range missiles. It goes straight to the point about the United States, basically that the fault lies at its feet, and that its self-imposed restrictions were not reciprocated by either the U.S. and NATO, with both showing and demonstrating that they are committed to escalating these short and medium range missiles. And then we also have this ongoing saga where Donald Trump, in a spat with Dmitry Medvedev on X, said that he was ready for nuclear war. Here is what he said.
When you talk about nuclear, we have to be prepared, and we're totally prepared.
So let's begin with you, Scott. You have been on the show many times sounding the alarm about the dangers of nuclear conflict between the United States and Russia. So where are we now, given Russia's latest announcement on the end of its own self-imposed INF treaty?
Well, let's first of all keep in mind that it was Donald Trump that pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in
2018. 2018, right?
So here we are. We're celebrating the 7th anniversary of that stupidity. The Russians, reciprocated. But what the Russians said is that we will continue to abide by the INF treaty in terms of systems, so long as the United States doesn't deploy INF capable systems to Europe. The United States did deploy a INF capable system. It's a containerized system that can shoot both the SM-3, SM-6 missile, the SM-6 variant known as the Typhoon, which would be a short-range missile in the surface-to-surface mode, but also the same containerized system, a derivative of the Mark 41 Aegis Ashore system, can shoot the Tomahawk, and there's no way of knowing what missile is loaded in the container system at the time. So we deployed it to Denmark, I believe, part of a NATO exercise. We claimed that it only had the SM-6 loaded up, but it doesn't matter. The Russians went, we will now begin to actively do the R&D necessary to produce our missiles, and they began the production of something called the Oreshnik missile. And in November of 2024, Russia actually did an operational test of the Oreshnik, striking the Dnipro factory in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine. What we see happening now is simply the fact that the Russians have gone to serial production of the Oreshnik, and so now instead of having a handful of handmade missiles produced to do testing, they've gone into serial production, and they are producing missiles that are going out into the field, into operational units, and they have deployed the first operational units armed with Oreshnik missiles. When you deploy a system like the Oreshnik, it's deployed at the regimental level, meaning that you'll put a regiment. That means they have 3 battalions. Each battalion has 3 launchers. So we're talking 9 Oreshnik missile launchers minimum, already deployed at an operating base somewhere in Russia. Belarus has announced that it will be receiving the Oreshnik system by year's end, I believe. And so Belarus will also have a regiment of 9 missiles. They're getting 10 launchers because they're going to have their own training facility to train up the Belarusian troops. But the Oreshnik is produced at the Vodka.
Revolutionary to salute to Yaya's kids for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is the way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, Queen. Salute.
It's machine building plant. It's an SS-20 analog. The SS-20 is an intermediate range missile that was eliminated during the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, something I was involved in. At that time, we estimated that the Russians or the Soviets could produce 60 to 80 SS-20 type missiles a year. That was in peacetime Cold War production. Now the Oreshnik is being produced in a quasi wartime with real world operational requirements. So my guess is that the Russians could probably up that production, to around 100 or so Oreshniks a year. If it's 9 Oreshniks per regiment, we're talking about the Russians, and there'll be a reload capability here. Plus, the Oreshnik will be configured both for conventional and nuclear capability. So, let's say 59, 45. We're talking about the Russians being able to field before year's end, probably in the area of 4 to 5 regiments, a couple divisions worth of Oreshniks, and then they're just going to keep producing them. And this is a game changer. It fundamentally alters the strategic balance of power in Europe. There's nothing the United States or NATO has that can counter this, both in terms of its conventional strike, which is a new capability. The SS-20 was not a conventional system; it was purely a nuclear system, and in its nuclear mode, it just changed it put all of Europe at risk. I mean, this is the thing. Medvedev's tweet basically said, "Europe, you committed suicide." Because now you guaranteed any future conflict will ensure the destruction of all your beautiful cathedral spires. It's the end of Europe if they want to go to war. The Oreshnik literally guarantees the destruction, physical destruction of Europe in the case of a nuclear war. And the fact that Europe will not be able to ride out a conventional war without suffering immense damage. There's nothing in the world today that can intercept an Oreshnik missile. And so this is absolutely a game changer. Does it destabilize Europe? I actually think in this case, at this point in time, brings about stability, because Europe's going insane, literally going insane in terms of their anti-Russian rhetoric and things of this nature. There's nothing Europe can do to match the Oreshnik, and there's nothing the United States can do at the moment to match the Oreshnik. The United States is seeking to deploy what they call the Dark Eagle, a intermediate range hypersonic missile. It was supposed to be deployed last year, but we don't know how to build it. And so we have yet to operationally field this system. They're talking about maybe sometime in 2026 getting the Dark Eagle up there. But an interesting thing about Medvedev's tweet, it's not just about the Oreshnik. He said that, and other systems. The Oreshnik is a derivative of what's called the RS-26 Rubyezh, which was a missile that the Russians had under development, but it ran into problems because of the INF Treaty. The Rubyezh, deployed with a certain warhead configuration, could be flown to ranges below intermediate range thresholds set by the treaty. But the problem is, if you put on a different warhead configuration, it could be flown to ranges greater. And once a missile's flown to ranges greater, it becomes an intermediate range missile as defined by the treaty. And the Russians didn't want to be seen as crossing over that threshold. So they put the deployment of the Rubyezh on hold. But the Rubyezh is, again, an SS-20 analog. It's a missile that was developed to fill the gap that was created in Russian strategic capabilities when the SS-20 was eliminated. What a lot of people don't realize during that time is that the Russians had built another missile called the Skorost missile. This was another intermediate range missile. It was built specifically for the Pershing II problem set, meaning that now when Pershing IIs, which are an intermediate range missile of the United States, deployed to West Germany, if the Pershing II went out of its garrison and went into an operational mode, the Russians didn't have anything that could immediately strike. Skorost means quick, and so the Skorost system was a system that was built to quickly respond to operational deployments of the Pershing II, so that if Russian intelligence, Soviet intelligence detected the Pershing II leaving its place, Skorost could be fired and terminate the Pershing II's existence before it could fire. The reason why I bring this up is that the Oreshnik is not the system to counter Dark Eagle. There will have to be a Skorost type analog produced to counter the Dark Eagle, so that when the Dark Eagle is deployed to Europe, if it goes to an operational place, there will be a new Russian system. And this is what Medvedev has alluded to. And I believe it's something I've been saying all along, that the Russians will fall back on Soviet doctrine and Soviet operational requirements set by the capabilities of NATO and the United States. And if we deploy Dark Eagle, there will be a new missile. It'll be the analog of Skorost. I don't know what they're going to call it. This is, again, game changer. It's checkmate in favor of Russia. People need to understand now that the Russians have dominance across the totality of the battlefield. I don't know if you saw Ukrainian drone operators do a post on Telegram, I think a couple of weeks ago, where they mocked NATO. They said, we're getting our asses handed to us by the Russians, who have mastered drone warfare. They They hunt us down and kill us before we can launch our drones now. The Ukrainians were doing pretty well in drone warfare, but now as soon as they deploy, the Russians have done pattern of life analysis of how the Ukrainian drones operate. And the second they go operational, the Russians are killing them, slaughtering them. This is why the Russians are making the progress they are in Pokrovsk and Sumy and elsewhere, where they used to be stopped cold by Ukrainian drones. They now just power right on through. And the Ukrainian drone operators got up and said, NATO needs to understand that a NATO-style army going up against the Russians will be dead in a matter of days, destroyed, totally destroyed. And that's just using drones. Now we throw in the Russian supremacy in the missile field. And they already had it with the Iskander, the Iskander-M, the Iskander-K, the Caliber, the Kinzhal. But now we throw in the Oreshnik, which will destroy every command and control center, every major logistical center throughout Europe. None will exist when the war starts. There will be no railheads. There will be nothing. It's all gone. Conventional Oreshniks will take it out. And then you throw in the Skoros, will take out the Dark Eagle and the other analog out there, including air bases. The Russians now are, in the, ability to totally mobilize their defense industry. They will produce missiles in the hundreds. They were producing 70 Iskanders a year. They're now producing 700. This is a game, set, match, Russia. How's the United States respond? Well, we sent nuclear weapons to England, B-61 12 bombs, understand that the Oreshnik will take them out too, along with all the other nuclear storage facilities. And then there's, Medvedev's famous or infamous, mean tweet. His mean tweet didn't say anything outrageous. It simply was a response to the stupidity of Lindsey Graham and others who threatened Russia with preemptive strikes. Basically saying, if you Russians don't continue this, we know how to do this. Ask the Ayatollah. It was basically a threat of, decapitation strike, first strike by the United States. And all Medvedev did is say, and we got the dead hand. The dead hand is a Cold War system known as perimeter. It's real, even though Medvedev said, if it exists, it exists. I know. I inspected at least 3 of the missiles that are associated with this system back in 1990. Those were SS-25, since then upgraded to SS-27 variants. Without getting too much detail on it, if we attempted a preemptive strike and it succeeded, let's say we killed Putin and Medvedev and everybody, blew out their command and control and all that, and we tried to take out their nukes, the perimeter has sensors all over Russia, detect radiation, detect seismic waves, and they monitor communications. And when you get a radiation detection, seismic detection, and communications no longer function, then the dead hand kicks in. These missiles that I talked about are launched. They have a broadcast capability. They don't carry warheads. They'll put out the launch codes, and everything in the Russian arsenal gets launched immediately to the United States, and the United States ceases to exist. That's the dead hand. And all Medvedev said is, you want to talk about preemptively striking us? We got the dead hand, and you'll turn into the Walking Dead. Trump apparently didn't understand that, because he does nuclear better than anybody. And he threatened to, or he said, I'm going to deploy Trident capable Ohio-class submarines. Here's the interesting thing, and I'll leave it at this. This is why it's so dangerous. The dead hand was conceived in the late 70s, fielded in the early 1980s, out of a fear that the Pershing II / Ohio-class / Trident capability gave the United States real preemptive first strike decapitation capability, especially if the Trident submarine comes close to Russian shores, Soviet shores, and fires the Tridents in a reduced trajectory, which eliminates being detected by long-range radars and provides shorter flight times. And that's why they built it. They built it because of the Trident. They built the dead hand because of the Trident, because of the fear the United States would put Ohio-class submarines near the shores and fire the Trident. So what did the president do? The president ordered 2 Ohio-class submarines to move closer to Russian shores. Now the Russian radars are going off all over the place. Russia isn't looking for a nuclear war, but Russia is not going to sit back and let the United States, carry out a preemptive strike. So now the Russian alert levels have gone up. Last fall, the CIA assessment was that there was a greater than 50% chance of having a nuclear war before year's end. And back then I said there's a greater than 50%. The CIA happened to agree with me. And we were very close to a nuclear war last fall. We avoided it, thankfully. It's even worse today. And it's going to get worse. We have the New START treaty that expires in February. When that's gone, there is no limitation. We will see the nuclear arsenals of both countries skyrocket as they pull out nuclear warheads in reserve. Right now, the treaty allows 1,550 operational systems, but there are thousands of warheads in reserve. And some of the ways that we've dropped our operational system is that, for instance, we take the Minuteman III missile and we make it a single warhead. But we've already exercised putting multiple warheads. We've already done it. The United States military has gone in and put multiple warheads on Minuteman III as a test of capability. We can do the same thing with the Trident. We lowered the warheads. We can increase the warheads. Overnight, if this treaty goes away, we will go from 1,550 to over 4,000 deployed nuclear warheads overnight. And the Russians can do the same thing. And this thing will then escalate out of control till we're talking about 20 to 30 nuclear warheads per side at a time when we have an idiot president moving to. This is a recipe for disaster. I mean, can it be avoided? I don't know. I hope. I mean, Donald Trump actually told a TASS correspondent on July 29th that he can't imagine allowing New START treaty to expire. He said, these are the kinds of things we don't allow to expire. Then what are you doing to keep it in play? Where are the negotiations? They're not happening. What's happening is the president's mouth is running away, and we're in an extraordinary danger situation. Anyway, that's a long answer to a short question. I'm sorry. I'll turn it over to Larry.
No. It's all right. And Larry, your assessment, Scott brought up Dmitry Medvedev, and he had this to say about the Russian Foreign Ministry's statement on the withdrawal of moratorium on the deployment of medium and short-range missiles as a result of NATO countries' anti-Russia policy. This is a new reality. All our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. So, Larry, to you.
When I entered on duty with the CIA in 1985, September of 85, the preoccupation at that time was the issue of the deployment of the Pershing II intermediate range ballistic missile to Europe. There were mass protests in a variety of countries in Europe against that deployment, but it was out of the fear that the Europeans had that they were now vulnerable to strikes from Russia with intermediate range ballistic missiles, that the negotiations took place between Reagan and Gorbachev, and Ray McGovern was directly involved with all of that at the time, and it produced the INF treaty. It was in, I think like December of 87, they finally signed it. Now, despite the tensions that existed between the United States and then Soviet Union, because remember, we were busy funding the Mujahideen, these Islamic extremists in Afghanistan, and killing a lot of Russians, a lot of Soviet soldiers. Despite that going on, we were still able to talk and find a negotiated settlement here with the INF treaty. And it did, in fact, reduce and eliminated, for 38 years, until Bush dropped out of it, or Trump dropped out in 2018. So, roughly 33 years where that threat had abated. And as Scott did such an excellent job of pointing out, it's back, and it's back with a vengeance, because now you've got Russia uniquely equipped in a way that the West is not. And then when you get into the issues of air defense systems that are capable of shooting down either ballistic or hypersonic missiles, the United States and Europe has nothing. They have nothing that can defeat the Russian capabilities. But what's really alarming are the signals that are being sent by Washington while Donald Trump is president. Let's start with June 1st with the spider web attack that took place at the strategic air bases throughout Russia. Now, they failed, but there still was showing an intent and the capability that was then of using the drones that was then replicated a month later, or I guess 2 weeks later, in Iran with the attacks and the decapitation attack that took place. So if you're a Russian military or intelligence analyst, you're sitting here watching, say, here's the West carrying out, helping Ukraine carry out these drone attacks. And I'm sure they did get assistance out of Azerbaijan to take out our nuclear air threat from the bombers. Then that's followed up by a decapitation attack in Iran. Then that's followed up with this General Christopher Donahue, just off the cuff at a NATO meeting, talking about how quickly the United States could overrun Kaliningrad and defeat the Russians. And saying that at the same time that Trump, and I don't know if Trump knew he was signing off on this, but Trump has to take the credit. He's president. Redeploys those nuclear gravity bombs, not just to England, but to at least, I think, 6 other NATO bases throughout Europe. First time that, we had withdrawn those in about 2008. And I don't know if the withdrawal back in 2008 was part of some treaty process or whatever, but the point was we were seeking to de-escalate the nuclear tension. Now we're doing this. And then on top of it, with Trump shooting his mouth off the way he was. I know that Judge Napolitano was interviewed by Dimitri Simes on the program that Dimitri hosts in Russia. And there were some Russian generals on there, and they were genuinely wanting to know, what the hell is the United States? Are you guys serious about this? So in the world of intelligence, the thing you want to do is remove uncertainty. You don't want to increase uncertainty and increase doubts. And everything that Trump is doing is leading to increasing doubts, increasing misunderstanding. And by that, you end up making the world more dangerous. And so I agree with Scott that I think we're in a far worse position than what the CIA projected last December.
Yeah, and Scott, you mentioned the New START treaty and its expiration and the dangers of that. Perhaps you could elaborate on this, given that you do have a project out. This is on your Substack. You have Project 38, which is a campaign centered on the production of a documentary film, 38 minutes, seeking to put nuclear disarmament back on the table as an American policy priority. So people can donate to that in the video description after the show. But talk about the dangers of this, given these latest moves, and how you put it all together into this project.
I mean, when the project was conceived, we weren't living in total insanity. I mean, it's become even more important now than ever before, but also more difficult to implement. The only good news is that the president appears to be at least cognizant of the fact that there's a treaty and it expires, and its expiration would be a bad thing. So that's a step in the right direction, because one of the goals and objectives of Project 38 was to, make sure the president was aware of the expiration and to try and convince the president of the absolute importance to extend this treaty, until which time a new arms control vehicle could be negotiated between Russia and the United States, probably even including China. Project 38, the name 38 comes from the 38 minutes of terror felt by the citizens of Hawaii in January 13th, 2018, when at 8 in the morning, the emergency broadcast system of Hawaii sent out a warning that there was a missile inbound to Hawaii. And they were to seek shelter immediately. This is not a drill. And this was at a time when the Trump administration and North Korea were, flexing their respective nuclear muscles. And the feeling was that the North Koreans had launched a nuclear weapon against Hawaii, and that they were all going to die. And for 38 minutes, people actually thought they were going to die. There's a lot of very emotional testimony from people about what was going through their head. Jim Carrey, the famous comedian actor, talks about being in Maui, and he got a phone call from his producer who said, "Missiles inbound, we're going to die." She said, "Do you want to meet?" He said, "I'm not going to spend the last minutes of my life driving to you in a panic." He said, "I'm on the beach. I'm just going to sit out and look out the water and think peaceful thoughts and wait for it to happen." But people were convinced they were going to die. And so then it turned out it was a absolute mistake on the part of the emergency broadcast system. It was a drill that went live, and it was just a disaster. But the point is, the terror was real, and the fear of a missile inbound was real. And so Project 38 is the heart of it is a documentary film, 38 minutes that I'm making, that seeks to capture those 38 minutes of terror. And the purpose to capture it is so that an audience is struck by the fact that when the missile's inbound, there's nothing you can do to make it go back. You're dead. You're literally going to die. And I want people to be put into that situation so I can ask them the question, now that you know you're going to die, if you could go back in time 6 months, what would you be willing to do to stop that missile from flying? You know, you're dead. You're going to die. What would you do to stay alive? And then the question is, why aren't you doing that now? And what Project 38 is, the now. What are we supposed to do now? And the idea is to create a documentary film and then assemble what I call a team B of people who have served in the government in a variety of roles, to include advising the president on nuclear threats, disarmament, policymakers, etc. Team B is a concept that comes out of the 1970s, when the CIA produced a national intelligence estimate about Soviet missiles that the foaming in the mouth neoconservatives disagreed with. The CIA saying, you don't have to worry too much about Soviet missiles. And they want to say, no, we need a new arms race to justify the building of the Peacemaker, the Midget Man, small ICBM, rail-borne missiles, new submarines, the whole thing, B-2 or B-1 bombers, B-2 bombers in conceptual. And so they assembled a team B of outside experts who then put together their opposing view. What I would like to do, in recognition that the president is being advised by the worst people in the world, literally people who know nothing, are ignorant. He has some people around him who are good, but they need help. To put together a team B and seek an audience with the president or his senior advisors to brief them on this alternative viewpoint that'll be fact-based, based on reality, not on theory and not on ideology. To convince the president of the absolute necessity of extending New START. All I want is an extension. This is the easiest thing in the world. Extend it 3 to 5 years so that we don't have the cap removed, so that we can keep the cap low and we can begin a process of negotiation. But the Russians are like, what is there to negotiate? You don't even want to talk to us. You still have this ridiculous policy of seeking the strategic defeat of Russia. Why in God's name would we get rid of the one thing that prevents your strategic defeat from ever happening, our strategic nuclear forces? So there needs to be a whole bunch of changes underway. That's not the purpose of Project 38. That would be the purpose of what comes after Project 38. Project 38 is simply about extending the New START treaty and the measures there. So there are some things underway. The film is being produced. There's some other things I hope to announce in a week that are happening. The bringing together Team B, and then once we get that done, to begin a PR campaign to take the film out there, show it, to generate support, so that in December we can go down to Washington D.C., hold a gathering at the National Press Club. Get a large LED screen, mobile screen, put it in Lafayette Park and play the movie for the president, make sure it can be seen by the Oval Office, and seek the audience and make the case, and hopefully get the president to agree that come February 4th, I believe it is, that this treaty will not expire, it will be extended. But this is going to require a lot of work, both here in the United States and in Russia. I mean, we actually need the Russian help on this one. We need Russia to indicate that it would be receptive to this. Right now, I mean, look, we just had the Russians say, you guys scrap the INF treaty. We're not deploying INF systems. This is tough. This is tough. The Russians are right. There's no reason, you can't say they're wrong to do this, but we're headed in the wrong direction. And so, Project 38 is, I think it's one of the most necessary projects that I could think of. I mean, I did Operation Dawn last year, which was designed to bring to the attention of the world the danger of nuclear war and trying to get candidates to commit to policies that avoid it. But through the grace of God and luck and everything else, we navigated those shoals. And I think Project Operation Dawn helped. Danny, you were an important part of that. Larry, you as well. I mean, this was a team effort, and I'm looking for a team effort on Project 38. So you can go to my Substack, scottritter.com. You'll see the Project 38 button. You can read about Project 38. And, I hate to ask for money, but I'm just telling you, these things don't happen for free. I mean, just getting the National Press Club, which was essential to Operation Dawn. I just want to say the briefing we did at the National Press Club helped turn the corner to get things done that avoided a nuclear war, or helped avoid a nuclear war. But that's a $12,000 to $15,000 proposition, just renting that space. And this can only happen with help. So if there's people that think this is a good project, go to scottritter.com, go to the donate button and donate. I will tell you that the donations that have been received so far, I don't want to, I can't say anything right now, but this time next week, you'll understand what your donations did. And then by the end of the month, you'll understand, or I think mid-September, you'll understand even more. We have momentum. We're moving in the right direction. I'm very optimistic. And Larry, you've known me a long time, and I'm generally a pessimistic kind of person. I mean, I always try to do the right thing, but I'm always, well, it's tough to. I am extraordinarily optimistic, and you'll know more why next week. But it's only because of the support that's been received. So I want to thank everybody who supported this project to date, and I'll give preemptive thanks to those people who might be considering to support it. There's other things we do though. Waging Peace was a project that was stopped. Did I tell you, Danny? Do you know the good news? The really weird news?
What's
Larry, are you aware of this as well? I got my passport.
Look at that. Amazing.
And it's amazing when you get a passport, lots of options happen. Like you can begin waging peace again, which was going over to Russia and doing things to, capture that. Waging peace, also was stuff that we did here. As you know, in June, we did a U.S.-Russian Citizens Summit, sort of a 40th anniversary of the 1985 space bridge. It was very successful, got a lot of attention. And there's people that want to continue that. So we will be continuing this, working to do various summits throughout the United States, and trying to get the Russians excited about that as well. Citizen diplomacy, it's a very important element of this. So the Waging Peace project is still on. And, we're just going to keep moving forward. Look, Danny, Larry, this is a team effort. We are part of what I call a family of podcasts and a family of podcasters. We collectively have the ability to influence millions of people. The videos that we collectively produce, and we're pretty much all on the same wavelength. We may differ on, nuance here and nuance there, but we're on the same side, the same team, the same wavelength. When we put our minds together, we actually have greater impact than CNN, Fox, and others. And what we're doing here, what you're doing here today, Larry, what you do is very important. Just so everybody knows, Larry, you went to Moscow earlier this year and interviewed Sergei Lavrov. I mean, that's a home run kind of thing. You've done other meetings. You work behind the scenes. You work in the shadows because I guess that's where you're comfortable working with your damn Hawaiian t-shirts. But yeah, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I muted you. Sorry.
Yeah.
I said a face made for radio. Just keep me out of something.
Yeah, well, I mean, we all have a face made for radio. Unfortunately, we got this StreamYard, but the point is, collectively, we can make a difference. It's us, the talking heads here, and it's the people watching. I mean, we actually have the ability to do very important work. This is what being a good citizen, both a citizen of the nation and a citizen of the world, is all about. So, again, thanks for allowing me to talk about it, Danny.
Yeah, sure.
I've got a new book out again. I'm plugging the book, not because my publisher wants me to, although they'll be happy that I do it, but because it's relevant. It's called Highway to Hell. It's the Armageddon Chronicles from 2014 to 2025. There couldn't be a more timely book because it's everything we just talked about is predicted in the book and discussed in the book and furthered in the book. This is about the absolute insanity, the insane road that we're on right now with Donald Trump and these non-experts, and the importance of arms control. So if you want a a primer to bring you up to speed on why Project 38 is important, why extending the New START treaty is important. Highway to Hell is a good place to start.
Yeah, definitely. Well, everyone after the show can go to the video description and find all the places to support all those projects, and especially Project 38. But with that said, speaking of insanity, Larry, we can begin with you. As the Ukraine conflict deteriorates, especially for the U.S. NATO side, we see, for example, has been referenced many times, but back in July, this is what General Donahue had to say about potentially, believe it or not, the next front in this campaign that Scott characterizes as the campaign to strategically defeat Russia. Here's what he said.
If you look at Kaliningrad, and it's, you can argue back and forth, but it's about 47 miles wide, surrounded by NATO on all sides. There's absolutely no reason why that A2AD bubble, to deter Russia, we cannot take that down from the ground in a time frame that is unheard of and faster than we've ever been able to do.
And that's only the beginning of the insanity on the part of the NATO side. Well, Trump's ambassador to NATO had these comments to say about Vladimir Putin. I think this demonstrates where both the U.S. and NATO side are when it comes to Russia.
Impossible to get in the mind of Vladimir Putin because it's sick and twisted and probably not logical. But I'm guessing that he doesn't want to take on the most powerful military in the world, which is the United States of America.
So, Larry, to you, what do you make of this posture right now from the U.S. NATO side vis-a-vis Russia? Just go off.
Well, delusional. They're like the evil queen and Snow White. They keep looking in the mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall. Who's the biggest, baddest of them all? And because the mirror is programmed to say, oh, you're the best, you're the biggest, you're the baddest, they start believing it. Well, it's time for that mirror to speak up and talk back some truth. Now, let's start with Christopher Donahue, that general. This knucklehead, I think, has spent too much time at altitude with no oxygen. I think it's been fried some brain cells. This is not a Ranger push-up contest, okay? He was an Army Ranger. This wasn't seeing how many push-ups you can do. Let's you tell us how quick we can take Kaliningrad. Okay, then what? Okay, how are you going to resupply it? You're going to concentrate any forces there? Because Russia's certainly going to be using nuclear weapons on you. Or now they don't have to worry about nukes. They can just use the Rushniks. That way they don't have to worry about any decontamination. I mean, just the thought that here's something that we can do tactically. Yeah, maybe you can do it tactically, but where does it put you strategically? And that's what these people are not thinking. And again, Whitaker, he's just all I say to him is, how'd that Afghanistan thing work out? The most mighty army in the world. So don't tell me about how big and bad you are, because again, we've seen you, the United States, in the Red Sea. You can't beat the Houthis. You're running up quite a string there, Whitaker. So it's best to just shut your mouth, be quiet, stop talking tough, and figure out how can we get along with Russia? Because Vladimir Putin may be many things, but sick, twisted, and illogical. Sorry, he is he's probably the most rational, logical leader in the world today, and he's had ample reason to get emotionally overwrought and react emotionally. I mean, we're sort of blessed that Dmitry Medvedev has not been president the last 2 or 3 years, because Scott's estimates about probability of nuclear war would have gone up to over 90% if Medvedev was calling the shots. So what we're dealing with is a Western leadership and a Western elite that is completely out of touch with reality. We are confabulators. Confabulation is when you say something that's blatantly untrue, it's false, but you really believe it. And that's what's taking place with the likes of Lindsey Graham and Donald Trump and Christopher Donahue. They are confabulators.
Yeah, well, thanks for using that word too, Larry, because it reminds us of our friend Andrei Martyanov, who could not make it today, but he often uses that word to describe exactly what you're describing. But Scott, to you, your reaction to this, sitting on the Russian side, I can only imagine what's going on in their heads when they hear things like this. But your assessment, your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I want clarification. Does Andre use the term confabulator or
confabulator? But both would apply.
But well, let's just start with Kaliningrad, just so people understand a couple, basic truths. Kaliningrad is constitutionally part of Russia and is treated by the Russian Federation as an extension of the Russian Federation. So any attack against this, A2AD bubble, as Chris Donahue called it, is an attack on Russia. And Russia's nuclear doctrine is quite clear that if the viability or if Russian territory is threatened, then Russia will use nuclear weapons to protect it. So right off the bat, understand that it's not just this exclave that can be taken out by NATO with no consequence. Two, I mean, maybe Chris wanted to refamiliarize himself with the order of battle there in Kaliningrad, but it's a relatively small place, tightly packed with air defense, and oh gosh, I don't know, they have their own nuclear capable of Iskander missiles there. They have a corps stationed there, plus another separate Marine infantry brigade. Many of these people have been cycled through the special military operation. They have combat experience that everybody in NATO lacks. The idea that this is going to be a pushover is a joke. I just think Chris would be in for a rude awakening if he ever tried to do it before the Oreshnik took out his command center. Oh, by the way, General Donahue, you'll be dead within 3 hours of attempting this, along with most of NATO's command and control, killed by Oreshnik and other systems that'll take you out. NATO doesn't have combat forces capable of doing this. I don't know what he thinks about. They're surrounded by NATO, but on much of that flank that they're surrounded by, we're talking about Baltic countries with zero military capacity, especially when it comes to offensive military capacity. The Poles have 14 days worth of artillery. The United States force there couldn't survive more than a week and a half before it would need to be totally replaced. We don't have follow-on forces capable of doing that. So Chris Donahue is just smoking dope. Straight up smoking dope to think that Russia could actually defeat Kaliningrad, let alone the consequences of what would accrue should you try to do this. Why would he do this then? Because Chris Donahue, Larry, he's more than just a ranger. I mean, this man was a Delta Force troop commander, squadron commander, commanded Delta Force, did a number of JSOC things. So he's smart. He's got a good brain housing group. Why would he do this? Well, because I think he was told, or I think this is my assessment of Chris Donahue, because I actually sort of respect the guy. I think he took over and he was told by Cavoli, we're weak as hell. We don't have any capability. I mean, right now, when you have United States starting to get into the FPV drone business, first person view drone, the kamikaze drones that we see operating all the time. And the U.S. Army put out a video that showed a soldier pulling out a training grenade. And we're going to now attach the grenade to the drone. And we pull the pin very carefully because we don't want it to go off. And then they fly it over. And look, we dropped it and we almost hit the target. We're going to keep practicing this, guys, because this is really cool stuff. If that's where we're at in drone warfare, it's over. And we're that way everywhere. We can't do anything, literally nothing. I challenge anybody to just tell me what you think we're going to do with a heavy armored brigade. Count the number of tanks, count the number of Bradleys, now apply them to a drone intensive environment and start subtracting quickly because they'll all be dead. Try and logistically resupply them. You know how much fuel an armored brigade uses? How are they going to get the fuel there when all the lines of communication are cut, when all the fuel dumps are blown, when everything's blown, because that's what the reality of modern warfare is. Donahue knows this. He was told by Cavoli, he knows this. He reported back to the Pentagon. They said, fake it. I think this presentation that was made was purely an exercise in bluster. It was chest thumping, puffing out by a man who knows better. A man who knows better. It was simply a statement designed to make the Russians react to you, to try and get the OODA loop operating in your favor while you're desperately trying to put together the pieces necessary just to survive. Because NATO has no strength. None. I know that I just pissed off a whole bunch of, USA types. You tell me what strength they have. Let's just do it. Let's rock and roll, baby. You just start walking me through the order of battle. You can't. I can walk you through the Russian order of battle. Are the Russians perfect? Nope. They have deficiencies? Yep. They make mistakes all the time, every day. But they've mastered drone warfare on a scope and scale that we can't even comprehend right now. They've mastered integration of fires. Their approach to air-ground combat is different than ours, but they've mastered it. We have no clue how to deal with fab bombs. The glide bombs that get dropped way the hell out here that come in and hit with pinpoint accuracy. We don't know how to do that. Do we have air defense? The Russians, when the Ukrainians bring in the Mirage and they start and the others, they start throwing these French bombs out there. The Russians shoot them down. The Russians shoot down air delivered bombs. When was the last time that was something that our air defense trained on, practiced on? Because it takes practice, guys. You actually have to learn how to operate your radars, and not operate your radars in peacetime mode, full on, full power. No, you'll be dead in 5 minutes. We're talking about waiting for the radio cue on real quick, learning how to read the screen, turn off, transfer over to another one, integrate it in through line, and get some sort of picture to begin an intercept solution. We don't know how to do it. Russians are doing it all the time. Every day they're shooting down, HIMARS, they're shooting down ATACMS, they're shooting down bombs. This is the reality of modern warfare. And unless you're doing it on a daily basis with a level of intensity that somewhat replicates reality, you're not doing it. NATO doesn't know how to do it. I don't know what they think they're going to do, but they're not going to do it. They're going to do what the Russians are doing. And the only way to get to that point is through training. And training's too damn expensive anymore. We don't train. Larry, you know this. You know about training. Yeah. Look, when I was in the Marine Corps, way back in the day, I used to walk to school uphill and walk home uphill. We didn't have buses, but I was in a field artillery unit in 29 Palms, California. This one battalion, we fired more live rounds for one battalion in a year than the entire Marine Corps fires in a year today. And that's the only way we became proficient, was we were in the field all the time, every day, firing, shoot, move, communicate, adapting our tactics, innovative training. It cost a hell of a lot of money. Today, we spend nearly $1 trillion a year on defense, but look how much of it goes to training. Not that much. And when we train, a lot of it's done on simulators. And I'm here to tell you right now, you can't learn on a simulator. You need reality. We don't do it. We don't know how to do the job we're supposed to be doing. We don't have the skill set. And if we take it and adapt it to, and we're called upon to do it in reality, we'll be slaughtered. Those Ukrainian drone operators were 110% correct. So yeah, I agree with Larry. Chris Donahue shouldn't have said what he said. I know why he said it, but this is the time when you actually take the 4 stars off, put them on the table and say, nah, boss, we got to be real here. We have to stop provoking the beast. And just one last comment on Whitaker. At a time when diplomacy is absolutely essential, the only way we're getting out of this is for Putin to sit down with Trump and for them to hash out something together. And it'll be done in a way that Russia's going to get what it wants. But in order for that to happen, Trump and Putin have to feel comfortable operating. You don't hear, it's open warfare on Donald Trump's brain. I mean, the Russians could get away, Russian officials every day could legitimately get away with calling the man, senile, stupid, a moron, whatever. You don't hear a single word like that out of the Russians. Not at all. Why? Because they're keeping the door for diplomacy open. You don't sit down and have meaningful discussions with people you call what Whitaker called Vladimir Putin. I mean, Whitaker's a moron. I mean, he was a prosecutor for the Southern District of Iowa, went after meth heads by throwing a book at them. I'm not saying that was the wrong thing to do, but that's all he knows. Never served in the military. Doesn't have a foggiest clue what it means to be in the military, fight a war, and he's also not much of a diplomat, because what he did is undermine any chance the president has of moving forward, in an effective manner with Russia, because you just don't have an ambassador of NATO calling the president of Russia names and then expect the president of Russia to go, yeah, hey, I'm ready to sit down with you. No, it's insulting. So Trump is just being failed across the board. I'm not saying Trump is the greatest thing since sliced bread. We know he isn't. But if he had better advisors, better people surrounding him, people who didn't undermine Trump on a daily basis, maybe we could find a way out of this absolute disaster we have that's U.S.-Russian policy.
Yeah, well, to your point, Scott and Larry, you can comment on this too. Vladimir Putin said exactly what you just said with regards to diplomacy when he was with Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. This is what he said, and it's almost word for word what you just said. All disappointments. Hold on, let me mute that. All disappointments come from excessive expectations. That's a well-known general rule. Here we go. But in order to approach resolving the issue by peaceful means, thorough discussions are needed. Not in public. This needs to be done calmly in the quiet of the negotiations process. So it's literally that's what diplomacy actually is, and it's exactly the posture that Russia has taken. But Larry, we're hearing all sorts of chatter from NATO itself, despite all the things that Scott just said about its weaknesses. We hear chatter everywhere about 2027. We hear that Russia is going to be ready for war with NATO by 2027. So NATO needs to wage war with Russia by 2027. We had Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk say that. General Alexis Grenouchich, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander and head of U.S. European Command, say this. We're hearing this all the time now. So what's your thoughts on this 2027 number, and any comments on what Scott laid out?
Well, the 2027 number is just, it's a made up number. Europe's trying to figure out how they're going to stay relevant. They have no strategy for dealing with the reality that's unfolding right now. And that reality is the Russian offensive is accelerating. The Ukrainian ability to resist that offensive is deteriorating with each passing day. I've been burned before making predictions about, it could be over by this, that, or the other date. But the trend line we're seeing now, and the fact that the Russians are moving not just in one area, but they're moving in Zaporizhia, they're moving further south in Kherson, they're moving up north around Kharkiv, they're moving in Sumy, and all the advances are to the west or in the direction of Ukrainian lines. We don't have a single place along that line of contact where Ukraine's able to assemble a force and punch a hole through the Russian lines and force the Russians to retreat. They were able to do so in the fall of September of 2022. And that's when, Russia, I think, had made a number of false assumptions about what Ukraine was going to do and what it was prepared to do. And so particularly up in areas around Sumy and Kharkiv up north, Russia got driven out, and it was an important setback. Similarly, it was General Surovikin who said, look, We got our troops down south in Kherson. They're on the west side of the Dnieper River. If they get cut off, we will have no way to resupply them. We'll have no way to reinforce them. So we're going to withdraw. And he withdrew them back across the territory and then proceeded to put in place lines of defense, which is come June of 2023 when the NATO plan, NATO designed counteroffensive that the Ukrainians launched, it was going to take them to the Crimea and they'd be bathing in the Black Sea in August. That was launched and it was a complete failure because Russia had learned to adapt and adjust quickly to the changing circumstances on the battlefield. And what we're seeing right now is the failure of Ukraine and the West to make those kinds of adjustments. And in some cases, the West might say, "Oh yeah, we need to resupply the Ukrainians with artillery rounds." And let's assume that right now the Ukrainians were, if they had functioning artillery barrels, they'd be firing 5,000 rounds a week. Okay, well, right now the United States can produce a grand total of 40,000 a month. So all of a sudden, we're going to run out of shells. I take that back. The Ukrainians are firing at 5,000 a day. So, in 1 week, a little over 1 week, you're going to you're going to use up what the United States can produce now in an entire month. And it's not just confined to that weapon system. It's confined to the same situation with tanks. The United States is no longer building M1 Abrams tanks. They're taking existing tanks and refurbishing them. Hey, and they can get you a new one in 2 years. Patriot missile systems. Yeah, we built 500 of those missiles, 500 to 700 of the PAC-3 a year. And yeah, okay, we understand that Russia's firing 500 to 700 drones and missiles in one night. And that if you have to use, let's say, a minimum of 2 Patriots per each of those, good Lord. So you've used up 1,400 and 700. So you've used up 2 years of production capability in one day. What happens the next day and the day after that? So what's taking place with this situation right now is there's not a single area you can point to where Ukraine can say, hey, we've got dominance, we've got superiority, we've got better technology in any area, whether we're talking soldiers, the weapons the soldiers are using on the front lines, mortars, artillery, RPGs, drones, combat aircraft, bombers, hypersonic missiles. Just give me one area, electronic warfare, just one area where you can point and say, boy, yeah, Ukraine's they got an advantage there. And they can say, well, they got the backing of NATO. Well, that's turned out not to be such a great advantage either. When you've got guys that, the U.S. has been unable to win a war since the end of World War II. So, it's not right now. I would argue that the average Ukrainian officer has far more combat experience than any officer in the U.S. military.
Yeah, well, I think this is a good place to talk about the battlefield situation. We get a bit more detailed on this, Scott, because we have CNN sounding the alarm saying Russia's summer offensive is turning into an escalating crisis for Ukraine, especially in the Pokrovsk area. And we also have something I like to note because in addition to Western mainstream media reports, if you just read, and mind you, your sanity might be damaged by reading such things. But if you just read what, let's say, Vladimir Zelensky says when he talks about, for example, conversations with Donald Trump, nowhere in here is there anything about the battlefield other than Russian attacks. So I think that says a lot about what's going on. But Scott, if you could give analysis, because I take it that a lot of the actions, behaviors, and reactions from Donald Trump's administration, Donald Trump, NATO have something to do with this.
Well, I mean, first of all, the what is the first casualty in war is truth, and you know, look at Trump just throwing out made up numbers. Somehow the Russians lost 20,000 dead in a month. Ukraine has only suffered 8,000 dead since January. My understanding, based upon conversations with people who were at the front line and some other anecdotal information, is that the Russians are losing 150, 200 dead a week. That's a lot. I understand that 200 dead a week broke the back of the United States during the Vietnam War. So this is not a insignificant number. And so we're looking at the Russians, dropping 600 to 800 men a month. A lot. That's bigger than a battalion. But that ain't 20,000 a month. The Ukrainians are suffering, depending on where you're at. They're dropping on a daily basis close to 1,500, 2,000 guys, dead and wounded, a day. These are unsustainable numbers, and yet they can't tell the truth, so they flip it. They flip the script, and it's it's the Ukrainians that are losing guys that they in numbers they can't replace. And what's happened here is that the Ukrainians are actually at a juncture right now where they don't have enough troops left to even with the recruitment they're doing. And just so everybody knows, not everybody who gets sent to the front line is getting popped on the head. The vast majority of Ukrainian troops that are being mobilized are being mobilized in a normal fashion. They show up, they get processed, they get trained, and they get to the front lines. But the Ukrainians don't generate enough forces to replace the casualties. And so every day that goes by, they're getting weaker. This isn't just me and my analysis saying, this is a Ukrainian parliamentarian announcing this on the floor of the Rada, saying, you guys got to be real here. We can't replace our losses. We get weaker every day. The Russians, on the other hand, get stronger every day because, yes, they're suffering losses, but they're recruiting far more people. Far more people. It's not even, and so not only are they replacing the losses at the battlefield, but they're beginning to assemble viable reserves, hundreds of thousands of men, which give them great flexibility when the time comes. But this allows Russia to maintain pressure. Ukrainians are very capable soldiers. They're better than anything NATO's got going right now. Even the United States Army couldn't do what Ukraine's doing on the battlefield. Couldn't survive the way Ukraine's surviving. I'm sorry, U.S. Army. That's just a statement of truth. They're battle hardened. They have sound small unit leadership, and it's certain areas when they have good middle management and senior leadership, they can stop the Russians from advancing. And given the right equipment, they can launch counterattacks to push the Russians back. Guys, that's not the end of the world. You have studied military history. You do know that even when the United States was beating the Nazis in April of 1945, if you read the unit diaries, 1st Battalion, 460th Infantry made an assault in here, but were counterattacked by the Germans and forced to fall back a kilometer and a half. Yeah, that's war. Read about the Russian advance on Berlin. The Germans are counterattacking up until the last moment. And when you counterattack and you pick the right time and place, you can push the enemy back. So the Ukrainians have the ability to stop the Russian advance in certain areas and launch counterattacks to push the Russians back. But they can't do that because in order to assemble those forces, they have to rob Peter to pay Paul. And we're at the point right now where if the Russians in the vicinity of Pokrovsk, the Russians stopped doing the frontal assault because the Ukrainians brought in troops. But where the Ukrainians brought in the troops, there's no troops to replace. They have to thin it out. And then the Russians just simply shift over, begin to advance. This is what's happening. They're creating an encirclement by advancing on the flanks. I think the left flank, the southern flank is sort of stopped right now. And so now they're making all the progress here. If the Ukrainians shift their forces up north, then the south will make it. And then when they shift to both, cover both wings, the center will advance. It's just the way it works. And it's happening all up and down the front line. The Ukrainians pulled some people out of the Zaporizhia area to come up and reinforce. The Russians started advancing to Zaporizhia. Can't stop them. We need to stop them in Sumy. So we pull people out of the Kupiansk area. But now the Russians are moving on Kupiansk. Wherever they pull people out to plug a hole, the Russians advance. That's the advantage that they have. And they're advancing at a greater rate of advance than they have at any time. The Russians still aren't doing the full up, big arrow stuff. The Russian attacks, I think I've described this before. I'll just go through one more time. This is explained to me by an officer in Abdi Aludanov's Akhmat Special Forces. He talked about mastering the 3s and the 6s. Because, Larry, you know this, when I went through, I did, fire team rushes as part of a squad advance, as part of a platoon advance, as part of a company advance. A fire team is 5 Marines, and we're doing fire team advances. That means one fire team rushes up, another rushes up, squad commanders controlling it, platoon commanders controlling it. You do that today, you get killed. Yeah. The Russians today, their assault group is 3 men. That's it, 3 men. They're supported by drones and everything. They got a drone overhead. They got artillery coming in. They got a drone team. There's a lot more Russians behind the scenes with the drones, bringing the drones in. But the assault team is 3 men. That's the 3s, and they will assault the position that they're on, generally defended by between 7 and 12 Ukrainians, and they kill them or they wound them and they take them prisoner. And as soon as that assault team can fail, they get killed, they withdraw. All right, you lost 3 guys. But generally speaking, the assault team will take the position, and then the 6s come in. The 6s are the men that rush forward to consolidate that position. Now you get 9 guys on target, you dig in, and you wait until the next assault. But that's what we're doing. We're talking about 3-man assault teams all up and down the field, assaulting a position, supported by drones and fire support. When things go south, you lose 3 guys. The reason why I want to emphasize this point is, do you know how many defeats the Russian would have to, have doing 3s and 6s to lose 20,000 guys a month? Okay, I'm just a simple Marine.
I can't do that.
Doing the math on that one. This is why I believe people who are fighting that say. I will also say this: the Russian wounded, and your number of wounded is generally reflective of your casualty rate on the battlefield. Although speaking to Mariat Karelin, he says there's days that go by where the Russians don't lose a single guy dead; they lose wounded, but nobody's dying. But the wounded used to be, are evacuated to, medical facilities in the rear. Back in 2022, 2023, these facilities were working overtime. I mean, they just wounded were just flowing back. Today, they're there, but the numbers have dropped way down. So that's anecdotal evidence that you're just not getting the flow through of casualties to be reflective of a 20,000 dead. Because if you're talking about 20,000 dead, you're talking about 60 to 80,000 wounded. That means the Russians losing 100,000 guys a month in terms of casualties, and a total force structure of 700 to 800,000. It's insane numbers. Why the president is speaking these numbers is beyond me. Why people allow him to say these numbers, because it just discredits him, discredits his credibility, discredits his team. It means nobody takes you seriously, because if you're that far removed from reality, the reason why I'm going through these details, guys, so your audience understands, there's no way in hell that these numbers are accurate. They're not. There's nothing out there to sustain them. The evidence is exactly the opposite. This is why, people are like, Scott, you're so pro-Russian. You got your nose up Abdi Aladonov. Yeah, because he's a frontline commander, and I learn a hell of a lot. And then I talk to other people too, talk to the drone operators, talk to the guys who provide the logistics resupply, talk to guys who affiliate with the special forces and what they're doing. And you get all the information. Yes, it could be, slanted and, not the whole story. But when you get it all and you average it out, and you compare and contrast, start matching the numbers, the picture that shows up is that the Russians are advancing across the entire length. There's nothing the Ukrainians can do to stop it. The Ukrainians don't have enough troops to, plug the holes, let alone build a reserve capability. And the Russians, they keep saying the Russian summer offensive. I don't know, Danny, Larry, I checked the calendar. We're sort of like midway through August. Summer's here, guys. So this just proves that we're not talking about calendar-driven events. I mean, the Russians aren't about looking at a calendar. Larry and I have made the same mistake, and I'm with Larry. I'm done pulling out the crystal ball. When the Russians win is up to the Russians.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say they're winning because, again, Larry's probably from the same school that I am, hyper aggressive. I don't understand 3s and 6s and drones. I don't. I mean, I'm beginning to. I'm starting to learn. But I'm about pushing the assault forward, consolidating, and continuing to exploit victory until you can't exploit anymore. As long as the enemy's retreating, you advance. And that's just the way the Marine Corps taught me. This is why we took Kuwait City in 3 days when Norman Schwarzkopf thought we never could take it, because we don't quit. We just keep going, we keep going, keep going. Well, that's not what the Russians are doing. They're doing something different. They're doing the attritional warfare thing, where 3 assault soldiers are taking out 12 Ukrainians. And they're winning. They're prevailing. And they understand that this conflict isn't just about the battlefield. It's about the economy, which is not going well for the Ukrainians. It's about politics. It ain't going. Did you see the SVR's press release the other day, Larry? We're about the secret meeting in Switzerland. I don't know if it's true, but what it did is it built upon things that we know are happening. We know Zelensky's meeting with the Swiss president. We know that Yermak meets with the national security advisor. We know the Ukrainians have had meetings with the United States and the United Kingdom. We know Zelensky has positioned himself to be. So the Russians have put together a report that totally undermines the credibility of the Ukrainian government. So you have this one dictatorial president, Zelensky, that everybody says has to go. And we have to preserve Ukrainian democracy. And we preserve Ukrainian democracy by handpicking Zelensky, who is a Banderist Nazi, by the way, and bypassing the electoral process. This creates instability, political instability inside Ukraine. So you have economic chaos, political instability, and military disaster. And the combined effect is designed to collapse Ukraine as a functioning nation state. That'll happen, I believe, inevitably, but it'll happen on a timetable dictated by Russia, and it's not predicated upon what we in the West want to happen on a given calendar date.
Yeah, well, Larry, I definitely want your detailed analysis. What Scott was saying about the battlefield in this article that does mention the summer offensive, which is well underway. They do report the things that somewhat, not in as great detail as Scott, but for example, in the Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk area, they just talk about the swift change and control of territory and the importance of drones in that. But Larry, your assessment of the battlefield situation and anything you want to comment on, especially with regard to Scott's close there about the bigger implications and the interconnected implications of it all.
Well, anybody who's listening, because I want to help you understand the revolution that's taken place in warfare that we're witnessing on the battlefield in Ukraine. Go out in front of your house, pretend that you're carrying an automatic weapon. Pretend or imagine that you're now going into an area that's occupied by an enemy. And you've got to figure out where they are. And if they're in an entrenched position, that they more likely are going to be protected if you try to shoot at them. So figure out, how are you going to move up that street? And that was sort of the situation even the Russians were in 3 years ago. But here's what the situation is now. You're that person. So you get you detect an area where you think the fire is coming from. So you get a drone in the air that's able to surveil and tell you who is exactly in what position. Are they hiding behind the house? Are they out behind the tool shed? Are they over to the left? Or are they over to the right? Then, instead of having to call in artillery, you can call in a drone which functions like the most precise artillery in the world because it carries a charge that can specifically go through a window, go through a door. And what we're talking about is that soldier now is in instant communication with the drone operators and with the commanders. Now, I'm sure Scott has been through some field exercises where in the old days where you're carrying like a Prick 77 radio, which, weighed a ton, and then you had to have batteries to keep that thing up. So all of a sudden there's an entirely new logistics trail that gets added on to this modern effort. But what the Russians have achieved is a full integration. The Marine Corps, and I'll brag for Scott at this point, since I was trained by a Marine colonel. The Marine Corps was different from the Army in particular, because Marine officers growing up were trained to do combined arms. So they were trained that they could call in airstrikes. They were trained to call in artillery strikes. They were trained to be able to bring in naval gunfire. They weren't just limited to one option. They had a broad range. The Russians have taken that and now have it on steroids. And they are literally writing the book on the transition to modern warfare with a whole variety of drones that are both FPVs as well as drones which are for observation and intelligence collection. And they've been doing this on the fly. They're making it up as they go along, but it shows you, it tells us something else about the nature of the Russian army. It is adaptable. It's not locked in, as many Western military analysts have wrongly believed, to old practices and bureaucratic structures and rigid hierarchies. No. These folks they're testing stuff on the battlefield, and if it doesn't work, they're able to go up to chain of command and say, "This is bullshit. This doesn't work. We're not going to keep doing that. This is how it works." And as Scott noted, they're in no rush. They're not on a clock. This is not like a football game where you're in the fourth quarter and you've got 2 minutes left. You got plenty of time. And I had asked General Brzezinski, a retired general, when I was in Moscow in March, and asked him specifically the question: why hasn't the general staff ordered all the bridges across the Dnieper to be taken out to cut off the line of communications? And he laughed and he goes, "I've been asking that myself." But then as we got into it, it appears that part of the general staff strategy was if they shut down those lines of communication across the river, and then there was no way to start resupplying what army and military presence of Ukraine was left on the east side, that it would not have attrited the NATO capabilities as well that were embedded. And the goal is to attrit not just Ukraine, but attrit NATO. And as we now look back over the last 3.5 years, it's turned out to be a damn effective strategy.
Yeah, and perhaps we can close on your comments on this, because Scott, I'm curious on your assessment of, is the military woes on the battlefield of Ukraine, and of course their backers, does this explain why we see not just Donald Trump, but the entirety, Europe, etc., or the entire collective West, are 100% in on relying on sanctions, which we've heard over the last several years were the most effective weapon? This is Donald Trump's promise for more sanctions.
They seem to be pretty good at avoiding sanctions. They're wily characters, and they're pretty good at avoiding sanctions. So we'll see what happens. But Steve is focused right now on.
So in the beginning, just to clarify, he said that there will be more sanctions, but we don't have to actually move into that. But because I can show you this before your comments, Lindsey Graham, these sanctions, these tariffs, both of them are going so far that now they're targeting India. So India is supposed to be a strategic cog for the United States against China. But now India is being targeted for its oil trade with Russia. And Lindsey Graham, who some have surmised is a huge part of Donald Trump's foreign policy making, was very appreciative when Donald Trump talked about how there's going to be massive tariffs for India, not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil and then selling on the market. They don't care how many people are being killed in Ukraine, and because of this, tariffs are going to be substantially raised. So, Scott, how do you see that? What do you make of my assessment that it seems like sanctions, tariffs, these things seem to be attempting to make up for the lack of success in the most important realm, at least from the standpoint of how this all began, with the hope that Russia would fall?
Well, I've always said that the sanctions aren't a policy. Sanctions are what happens in the absence of policy, meaning that when you don't know what to do, sanction. And what the United States has done with this is that we've turned this act of impotence into a long-term strategy of destabilization. And so that was just the approach we took with Saddam Hussein, where we slapped sanctions on and just kept them on until which time we were able to, bring about the collapse. This was the Syrian strategy. And it's a strategy that we're trying to apply against Russia. But as the president said, Russia are wily characters, and it's not going to it's not going to work. But I think what you're seeing with everybody jumping on the sanction bandwagon is that we just don't have any other viable alternatives. But they don't understand that we are unable to implement the sanctions that we seek. China's told us to pound sand. India has told us to pound sand. Brazil has told us to pound sand. Basically, everybody in regards to this has told us to pound sand. These sanctions are going to have no impact. I'm sort of curious to see what the president is going to do on Friday. But he may be escalating us towards a major economic confrontation with the world, with BRICS. He thinks that this is going to destroy BRICS. I personally believe that this is going to solidify BRICS and be the glue that brings BRICS together. This is bad policy, but it's because we don't have a policy. We don't have a Russian policy. We don't know what we want to accomplish. It's nonsensical what we say about Ukraine and what our goals and objectives are. We don't have a NATO policy because we can't afford what he says. I'll leave it at that. The president right now is bragging about $600 billion that the EU has promised him to invest in America. I get to invest wherever I want. It doesn't exist, Mr. President. Ursula von der Leyen admitted that she couldn't. She doesn't have any control. There's no $600 billion. There's nobody lining up to give you that money. The $720 billion that of energy purchases over the course of 3 years, it's a made up number. It can't happen. I mean, I think Europe bought $76 billion total per year last year. How do you get that to be now $250 billion a year? The United States only produces $310 billion worth of energy, and suddenly reallocate that all to Europe. Europe couldn't receive $250 billion worth of U.S. energy because it's LNG. That's liquid natural gas. You have to have a place to receive it. You have to offload it. You have to have the deliquefying facilities. Europe doesn't have that infrastructure. It's a totally made up number. Everything this president does is a totally made up concept. And right now we simply don't have any way to leverage or to put pressure on Russia other than the threat of sanctions. But as the president said, Russia is not going to blink at all, and neither are the nations that are working with Russia.
Yeah, Larry, bring us home. What's your assessment of this seemingly just absolute reliance on sanctions as the primary weapon now, as the battlefield becomes just stagnant for the United States and the collective West, untenable?
24 years ago, in the year 2000, the United States was the major trading partner of 75% of the world. So if you did a global map of it, most of the world, and the world would associate blue with the United States, 75% of the world was blue. Today, when you ask that question, which country is the major trading partner of the majority of nations? It's like 80% now are majority trading partners with China. China and the United States have completely flipped roles. Sanctions and tariffs can be powerful tools if you're in the position the United States was 24 years ago, but not today. if you're the only supplier of rare earth minerals, then if I decide to sanction those, put a sanction on those so that I'm not going to ship them to people outside that need it, those countries outside are going to be in trouble. Likewise, if you, the United States, are putting sanctions on me, China, and because of that, China says, okay, screw you. I'm not sending you any more rare earth minerals or magnets, which you absolutely need, or pharmaceuticals. Now, all of a sudden, the power arithmetic is changed. It's the United States is vulnerable, not China. And so Trump is living in a world that doesn't exist anymore economically. He thinks it's still 2000. He thinks the United States is still being able to call the shots. So look at what happened with we told Brazil, okay, we're not going to sanction orange juice because if we sanction orange juice and the tariffs on that go up, we're going to have a lot of pissed off people who drink orange juice. But we are going to tariff your coffee. And what did the Brazilians do? They didn't go, oh my God, we've lost that the United States are the only people in the world who drink coffee. They went, no, okay. They just signed a new deal with China. You know what? There are a lot more coffee, even though they drink tea in China, still a lot more coffee drinkers in terms of total numbers than in the United States. How about pork, soybeans? The Chinese actually at the start of tariffs, man, they bought a lot of soybeans out of the United States, just piled up because they got it in the store. But now that the tariffs are kicking in, they're buying from Brazil and from Russia. So the point is, if you impose sanctions work if you have monopoly control. Tariffs work if you got monopoly control. But if you're living in a competitive world where you're not the sole source, and in fact you're just one of another group of guys or countries, then it is a counterproductive, damaging strategy.
Yeah, and I just pulled up that reference mainstream media reporting on what you're saying, Larry, regarding Brazilian coffee. And if you go to China, you know how big of a deal this is because Chinese domestic brands for coffee are very important and popular. So the fact that China is willing to open up their market just goes to show how far all of these countries are willing to go to counter the tariffs, counter sanctions. It's definitely a losing gambit.
Yeah,
gentlemen, anything else you'd like to say? Oh, Larry, please.
Let's talk about Ukraine, shall we? Because first it was 60-year-olds. Now it's 14-year-olds being recruited by Zelensky and to fight and die in NATO's proxy war against Russia. You can't make this up. Ukraine to launch military training for teenagers as young as 14 years old. The Defense Ministry is pushing for early paramilitary education amid struggles to maintain recruitment levels. Ukraine is set to introduce a national program of military instruction targeting teenagers as young as 14, a senior Defense Ministry official revealed on Monday. All of this coming amid struggles to maintain recruitment levels. Ukraine's armed forces rely on mass compulsory conscription, but the campaign has faced growing public resistance and complaints about its abusive execution. The authorities, meanwhile, are pushing for early-stage education to instill what they describe as nationwide culture of resistance. So this is stunning, this idea that we're going to start throwing 14-year-olds into the meat grinder, all for NATO's proxy war. Before we get to the NATO piece of this in a second, which is absolutely infuriating because now we have this new amount of money and weapons that are about to flow to Ukraine, thanks to NATO support, the United States support, and all of this. Before we get there, though, just think about the multiple generations have now been wiped away and killed in NATO's proxy war with Russia for nothing. Nothing. In fact, continued loss of land. And if this continues even further, maybe the loss of your entire country, loss of Odessa, becoming a landlocked country. So what you're doing is you're throwing away the future promise of Ukraine by taking 14-year-olds now and throwing them into this. So the real question is about conscription, because we've all seen the videos, of course, about slightly older individuals being rounded up by the goons, the conscription goon squad, thrown into those white vans, thrown onto the front lines to be killed or maimed, permanently maimed in Ukraine. Now we're going to add 14-year-olds to this mix, but of course they're saying it's just for military training in preparation. Right.
Oh,
so who's going to check
the
this?
way that the Japanese, the Imperial Japanese used to train their students to use bayonets on dolls and pretend they were Chinese?
Yeah. So
Like
get them
that?
started early.
Yeah. Is that a society you want to live in where young men are given this education of aggression against another race? Is that what we're doing? Because I thought we learned that maybe in the 30s that wasn't a great.
So, ladies and gentlemen, our bodies are under attack, and not just from the air we breathe or the food we eat. We're being exposed to mRNA technology injected into our food supplies, spreading through shedding, now 5G. Idea that these 14-year-olds won't be rounded up and now that this goon squad will have carte blanche to be able to go out and start training 14-year-olds, how many of them they're going to check their ID? When these guys show up on the street with their white vans, are they going to ask a 14-year-old for your identification to make sure he's of age? This is the most corrupt country in all of Europe. They're going to throw these individuals into the machine, and we're going to start.
These are babies.
Yeah, we're going to start hearing reports of 14-year-olds and even younger. One person on our show last week even said that between 11 and 15-year-olds are already being thrown into rounded up by conscription goons.
Mm-hmm.
So now you have like a national policy that says 14 years old, but I don't buy it for a second that it's just they're gonna go through a training process. You're gonna check their ID. No, you're gonna throw them into these white vans.
But
and they're
even
gonna
if
kill.
that's the case, again, even if it's just a military education, it's not just boys then. So then girls will continue to be given this military indoctrination by the public schooling. So this is what American taxpayers will be subsidizing, because we see how much we're subsidizing the Ukrainian government. So not only will be subsidizing old men, old grandpas that we spoke about last week, going into military conscription, which we know will mean they'll be thrown in, but then now also children in high school, given this indoctrinating anti-Russian sentiment. And again, how is that going to play out? How is that going to create a peaceful environment when young people are radicalized in their, of course that already happens, but in their public education? How can is that a society anybody want? And how can you ever pull that back? So say, again, like the Imperial Japanese used to use bayonets and like have children spearing stuffed dolls of Chinese. How are you then going to walk that back and be like, we're at peace? We're at peace with the Russians now. So whatever you learned in your school books, we love them. No, this is not a lasting peace. This is not a society you want to live in. Speaking of that money.
Yeah, let's talk about NATO now.
Okay, Zelensky is back to his old cold calling job where he gets Western leaders to commit weapons and money. Productive conversation with Trump with the key focus of ending the war. Bullcrap. We're grateful to POTUS. We love each other. We are talking about sanctions with Russia. We know Russia is stepping up, their aggression. Also, we want, joint European decisions, bilateral defense. What does that mean? That means, bilateral defense cooperation with America means we want American troops on the ground. Clearly, that's what he's always wanted. He says this is one of the strongest agreements so far. One of the strongest agreements this could be. Thank you to President Trump. Love you. We're bros. Mark Rutte talked about, yes, we just had a call with Zelensky, $1 billion in funding from allies, he says, for U.S. equipment for Ukraine. So he says this is all coordinated by NATO, weapons to save lives, he said. How are we still doing this? This is the bull stuff that we have had to watch since 2022. It's 2025, and Zelensky's just allowed to go back to the trough and start this again, lies and money, and now money for indoctrination of his youth. How are we here? Didn't President Trump say he was going to end this war at the very least? Kamala Harris said, no, we're going to keep this war going because we can't give it up. So we had no vote there, right? President Trump is actively violating this peace agreement, this promise, this campaign promise, by giving more money to Ukraine. I mean, if you can't make a deal, you can't make a deal. So say I couldn't do it, but then the money should stop.
China has fired a decisive shot in its economic war with the West by choking the supply of critical rare earth minerals to US and European defense firms, according to an exclusive report by the Wall Street Journal. Beijing's bold crackdown on exports of rare earth elements is delaying weapons production, inflating costs, and exposing just how vulnerable America's military machine is without Chinese minerals. Rare earths may sound obscure, but they are the backbone of modern warfare. From F-35 jet fighters to missile guidance chips, night vision goggles to battlefield drones, nearly every cutting-edge Pentagon system depends on materials that China dominates. Beijing supplies over 90% of the world's rare earths. Now, it is wielding that dominance. With new export controls, stricter documentation demands, and selective licensing. The result, the WSJ reveals, is striking. American suppliers are wilting. Drone parts makers are delaying deliveries by up to 2 months. Prices of some critical minerals have surged 60-fold. CEOs are warning of production cuts if China doesn't resume flow soon. US officials may talk tough, but Beijing is showing that it holds the real leverage. Washington is scrambling, pumping $400 million into rare earth miners, trying to partner with Canada and Australia for alternatives. But those projects will take years to come online. Until then, America's most advanced weapons remain chained to China's supply lines. As tensions rise in over trade talks, Beijing is signaling it will no longer power US militarization for free. This is not just economic retaliation, it is strategic warfare. With a single export curfew, China is proving that it can stall the Pentagon's war machine without firing a shot.
If you have a smart president, you will never lose the standard. If you have a stupid president like the last one, you would lose the standard. And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country any longer.
Well, folks, if the United States losing the dollar standard is like losing a war, then buckle up, because the dollar is having its worst year since 1973, and something unprecedented is happening with U.S. Treasuries. Take a look at this graph and focus on the pink line, showcasing how China is dumping US treasuries at great speed. China has now sold off more than $300 billion worth of treasury bonds over the past 5 years, something we've never seen a major trading partner do on this scale and with such clear strategic intent. As the world watches the dollar's dominance continue to erode, this article from The Guardian says it best. Trust in the US is eroding. The question isn't if the dollar will lose supremacy, it's when. Now, at the heart of the de-dollarization movement is BRICS, the economic bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who is now joined by partner countries to make an economic alliance that surpasses the G7 in population and GDP growth. In fact, emerging Asia accounts for 60% of economic growth in the future, with founding BRICS members China and India driving more than half of that growth, along with Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, all of whom are partner members of the BRICS organization. It's very clear that the future of our world is coming from countries aligned with BRICS, not the declining G7. But here is where things get very interesting. No matter how much Trump threatens BRICS, one thing is clear. The world no longer fears the US government. Trump tried to intimidate China and India, proudly boasting that he would impose 100% tariffs against them if they continue to purchase Russian oil. The results? India and China both rebuked Trump's threats and will continue buying cheap Russian oil, as leaders will not allow American policymaking to shape its choices on vital energy supplies. Trump claimed with the smart president, the US would never lose the dollar as the world's reserve currency. But in a twist of irony, it's Trump himself who's accelerating de-dollarization, undermining the very power and prestige he says he wants to protect. But what makes this even more puzzling is that the weakening of the US dollar isn't entirely accidental. In fact, it appears to be part of a deliberate strategy by the White House. A weaker dollar can make American exports more competitive, supporting Trump's goal of reviving US manufacturing. But as with many of his administration's policies, the approach is riddled with contradictions. Trump has no coherent long-term strategy and no clear trade framework. Supporting American industry through currency devaluation requires stable and consistent trade. But Trump's erratic tariff threats have frozen global trade, alienated allies, and sent a clear message to the world. The United States is no longer a stable or reliable economic partner. In effect, the administration is making a high-stakes gamble, one that's almost certain to backfire and accelerate the shift towards a de-dollarized world. And that's exactly what we're breaking down in today's video. Stay tuned, because this massive gamble puts not just the US economy at risk, but the entire world financial system. Let's jump into it. But before I do, I want to share with you how you can prepare yourself as the US dollar continues to lose value in the future. Last September, I flew to Malaysia to speak at the Nomad Capitalist live event in Kuala Lumpur. Nomad Capitalist was founded by Mr. Andrew Henderson, an incredible entrepreneur who was frustrated by huge tax bills and built a new framework for legally reducing taxes, gaining a second citizenship, and investing in countries that actually want your business. He turned that experience into Nomad Capitalist, a company that helps you create a customized global plan no matter where you start from. Trump has proved to the world that the future will only be more chaotic. And in reality, you need a plan B. And Nomad Capitalist is the best company I've found to help you achieve just that. I'm traveling back to Malaysia this September to speak once again at this year's event. And if you want to join me in KL and learn the best strategies to protect yourself in today's chaotic world, simply visit nomadcapitalist.com/live and learn more about how you can attend this year's event. I'm honored to return as a speaker to the event and look forward to seeing you all in Malaysia next month. But now let's get back to the story of the US dollar and why for many years the US government enjoyed exorbitant privilege of the dollar. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, countries around the globe are often forced to trade in dollars, even when their transactions don't involve the United States directly. For example, if a German company is doing business with a Chinese manufacturer, that trade would still typically be settled in US dollars, regardless of whether an American firm is involved. This global need for dollars creates a constant and immense demand, which continuously props up the dollar's value. And that's why the US can get away with things that would wreck most other economies, like running a massive budget deficit and having a national debt surpassing a staggering $37 trillion without sparking a full-blown currency crisis. Since everyone needs dollars to trade, the US can push its inflation onto the rest of the world. At the same time, global wealth flows into US assets like the stock market, making the dollar even stronger. The dominance of the dollar allows the US to live well beyond its means. It's a privilege that no other country on earth possesses, and one that it frequently abuses. But this system that has lasted since the end of World War II is collapsing. and it's collapsing fast. Trump is gambling with this very system by deliberately pursuing a policy of dollar devaluation. Despite his public speeches emphasizing the importance of maintaining dollar dominance, his administration is actively moving forward with a strategy aimed at weakening the dollar in an attempt to make American manufacturing more competitive. A devalued dollar makes US-made goods cheaper for foreign buyers, boosting exports and helping domestic manufacturers grow. At the same time, it makes imported goods more expensive for American consumers, reducing the competitiveness of foreign products and giving US producers an advantage in their own market. Now, the US can achieve this kind of devaluation through methods like lowering interest rates, printing money, running large deficits, or signaling support for a weaker dollar, all of which reduce demand for the currency. This policy direction has been crafted by Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick and Secretary of the Treasury Scotty Bessent. Trump approved these moves because they've been sold to him by his cabinet as a win for American manufacturing, something he's publicly passionate about. But at the same time, Trump also clings to the idea of a strong dollar, because he loves the prestige and power that comes with the US currency being supreme. This is why he constantly boasts about protecting the dollar's dominance, even as his administration enacts policies that directly undermine it. This disconnect between what the president says and what his administration actually does is a defining feature of his leadership, and it raises a legitimate question. Does Donald Trump even fully grasp what these policies mean or what their long-term consequences will be? Quite simply, Donald Trump wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to boost American manufacturing while also keeping a strong dollar. But the most disastrous part of it all is that both of these goals require a coordinated set of second-order policy decisions to succeed, neither of which he is pursuing. Simply devaluing the dollar alone is not enough to bring back American manufacturing. It is just one policy that must be implemented alongside a range of other supportive measures. Let's take a look at China to understand how this actually works. China is by far the world's largest industrial powerhouse. By 2030, China's share of global manufacturing is projected to reach 45%, while the US share is expected to fall to just 11%. China's success is the result of decades of strategic investment by its government into crucial industrial foundations. This includes major investments in education to equip the population with the skills necessary to build and operate modern industries. At the same time, China has poured resources into infrastructure, constructing state-of-the-art ports, roads, telecommunication networks, and transportation systems. But perhaps most critically, China has made massive investments in energy capacity, which has expanded exponentially through a diverse mix of sources, including the largest rollout of renewable energy in the world. Meanwhile, US energy production has remained largely stagnant since 2005. After all this, China has also consistently devalued its currency, making its imports that much more competitive, something the US is now trying to copy. But the ironic thing here is that Trump believes he can skip over all the crucial steps required to build a competitive manufacturing economy and go straight to devaluing the currency. But while he's focused on weakening the dollar, the foundational elements of a strong industrial base in the US are crumbling. Infrastructure is deteriorating, education levels are at historic lows, and energy production has remained stagnant for years. Because these critical inputs are missing, there are no real incentives for manufacturers to bring their production back to the United States. So while Trump is devaluing the currency in hopes of making American goods more competitive, there are no domestic goods or factories to compete with Chinese products in the first place. Quite frankly, they simply don't exist in America. America's industrial capacity was hollowed out many decades ago, and no amount of wishful thinking or currency manipulation will change that reality. And this leads us to yet another fundamental contradiction in the president's agenda. Trump says he wants to bring back US manufacturing, a goal that would take massive government investment. But at the same time, he's calling for spending cuts, smaller government, and lower taxes. In other words, he wants to build without paying the bill. These policies are inherently incompatible. You can't rebuild an industrial economy by starving it of the public investment it needs to function. So all of this leads to the worst possible scenario for the United States. By devaluing the dollar in isolation, the US literally gets the worst of both worlds. A devalued dollar undermines the dollar's privilege while doing nothing to help US manufacturing. Americans will be paying more for foreign products while there are no domestic alternatives on the shelves to replace them. These are just some of the reasons why devaluing the dollar simply won't work for the United States. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. Trump's erratic policies aren't just ineffective, they carry much broader implications for the US-led global economy. By creating an increasingly unpredictable trade environment, Trump is chipping away at one of the United States' greatest economic advantages, his reputation as the safest and most stable destination for foreign investment. That reputation rests on the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, which for decades has given investors confidence that their money is secure in US markets. But that confidence is unraveling through constant attacks on the Federal Reserve, chaotic tariff wars, ballooning national debt, and a pattern of flip-flopping policies. Trump has undermined the very predictability that once made the dollar and the United States so appealing. And we're now witnessing these consequences in real time. Something rare is happening on Wall Street. Stocks, bonds, and the dollar are falling at the same time. Normally, when stocks fall, investors flee to bonds or the dollar as safe havens. But when all three are dropping together, it signals a crisis of confidence in the entire U.S. economic system. It means investors no longer see any corner of the American market as a reliable place to park their money. Now the world is looking elsewhere. International markets are outperforming U.S. stocks by a wide margin. In fact, the Hang Seng Index from Hong Kong is the best performing stock market to date. And check out this report from Bank of America, which states fund managers had preferred U.S. stocks over international stocks for most of the past 2 decades. But that's changed this year. The latest survey out in mid-June showed a startling statistic. Only 23% now preferred U.S. stocks. This divergence tells a clear story. Capital is starting to flow away from the United States. Pension funds, endowments, and institutional investors are increasingly looking to foreign markets, not just for growth, but for stability. There's no question that a broader trend of moving away from the dollar is underway, and Trump's chaotic policies have become a major accelerant. And it's not just other advanced economies shifting investments towards markets in places like Hong Kong and Europe. Central banks around the world are also making massive gold purchases, pushing the metal past the euro to become the second largest global reserve asset. Since the start of 2024, the price of gold has surged nearly 62%. Countries are scrambling for an alternative path, with BRICS now expanded to 20 member states, representing half of the world's population and accounting for 40% of the global economy, including the crucial additions of Vietnam and Indonesia. Meanwhile, there's been a sharp rise in countries trading directly in their own currencies. Most recently, the central banks of Egypt and China agreed to move away from the SWIFT system in favor of local currency trade and the use of China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS. All of these developments are rapidly chipping away at the dollar's dominance, much faster than anyone expected. What we're witnessing isn't just a policy misstep. It's a turning point. The dollar's central role in the global economy has always been as much about trust as it is about economics. Trust in U.S. institutions, trust in long-term stability, trust in competent leadership. But that trust is now eroding at a pace that no one anticipated, driven not by external enemies, but by internal confusion, contradiction, and short-term thinking. The dollar has long acted as the spine of the global financial system, but a spine can only bend so far before it breaks. If the current trajectory continues, we may not just see the end of dollar dominance, we may be living through the end of the American economic order as we've known it. And what comes next won't be shaped in Washington, but in the capitals of a new multipolar world that's already preparing for life after the US dollar. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's deep dive into the US.
Coffee. Follow me.